right now, I'm very excited to call up our first panel. And so our first panel is going to be understanding AI ethics as cultural practice. So I'm hoping that Professors Martin and Sloan will come up and sit here when they get a chance, and I'll introduce them as they do so. Kirsten Martin is a professor at Notre Dame. She is specifically the William and Hazel White Center Professor of Technology Ethics, and she is the director of the Notre Dame Technology Ethics Center, and she is a vibrant participant both in conversations around AI ethics and technology generally, but also a renowned privacy scholar. So many of us know her from that context as well. We really appreciate you being the discussant for this paper. And the author is Mona Sloan, who wears many hats, but is a sociologist of technology with affiliations at NYU, where she is, for example, an adjunct professor in the Tandem Engineering School, affiliations at GovLab, affiliations with the University of Tübingen in Germany, and an all-around polymath and excellent commentator on these issues. So we're very excited about our paper, and we're very excited to have this panel. So I'll turn it over to you.
So I'm going to talk about understanding AI ethics as cultural practice by Mona. And so first I'm going to just briefly talk about the flow of the paper, kind of like the main takeaways, and then give a few comments. And I have additional that I can give you. I think what's interesting about this paper is in its core, it's I think a grounded theory or some sort of inductive study around how do entrepreneurs, startups in AI think and talk about AI ethics, and then kind of focusing in on a specific concept and really trying to understand in the end, how do we theorize about AI ethics, about how people should or regulate AI ethics, and how do people in practice actually do this thing? And that comparison is actually where we can find some interesting insights. It begins with how important AI is, and also importantly, the role of AI startups. So I think that's a contribution as well to talk specifically around startups. Entrepreneurship in business schools and business theory is different than an ongoing entity. So we theorize about how and why they do things in a different way. And that might be a place to look is in entrepreneurship literature, specifically sociology. I mean, there's sociology and economic versions of entrepreneurship. And then going to define AI ethics in startups, and then kind of getting to the methods. And I think page 4 summarizes really kind of the goal of the paper, if I'm correct. This solid body of social science scholarship on entrepreneurial work and technology, which exists, sits opposite the vastly accelerating space of technical interpretations of AI ethics, such as responsible data management, model reporting, algorithmic impact assessments, and many more. And falling between the cracks is an empirical knowledge on the dynamics of AI ethics as social and cultural phenomenon. So we have these ideas around AI ethics in theory and some technical ideas, and then we have entrepreneurship and how do startups go and how do people make these decisions in design. And this is an understanding of like, how do these work together? And the guiding research questions for this research are specifically, although this sounds, I think it's the same research questions as your previous paper. So there's some specifics here that are a little bit different, but in general, the overall idea is, what are the plurality of meanings of ethics among German AI startups? What are the basic social assumptions and cultural processes? And mainly focused on startups. I think an open question is whether or not here you're saying that you're theorizing only about German startups as if they're different than all other startups. That could be true. I don't know the entrepreneurship literature enough to know that if it's worthwhile, or if you actually are just asking if you could repeat those research questions and take the word German out. It's not clear to me coming up to that point why we're theorizing about specifically only German startups versus German startups just being the study design. Does that make sense? But I think you could justify that to me in different ways. Like you could argue that German startups are different for different reasons. So the study is actually focused on understanding how German entrepreneurs actually talk about AI ethics, doing 64 interviews and covering a lot of different themes. So the kind of it doesn't say exactly the length of the interviews, but they must have been long given the number of questions and kind of how they were identified. And there's a short analysis section. And then the main kind of ideas is maybe a dozen different concepts of what people talk about: co-determination, responsibility, honesty, education, exchange, these types of ideas that come out of the grounded theory analysis. And this paper is actually just focusing on the idea of, how do you pronounce? Miteinander, close, being together. So this idea of being together is, so another paper from FACT, right, from ACM, actually focused on different concepts. This paper actually just focuses in on the being together concept. And so I think one of the things that seems key here is this idea of being together was not so much about, I'm quoting now, what values were in place, but how they were enacted between people as a matter of living values and as a matter of cultural and society, or sociality. And so what I think that there's some interesting ideas that we really wouldn't get from current AI ethics ideas that we have in theory or in our attempts to regulate AI in any ways, that this grounded, it really shows the power of this type of inductive research to understand actually how do they think and talk about these things. And this heightened significance of sociality in AI ethics underlines the disconnect between how outside critics and applied technology researchers conceive of and deploy mitigation strategies for AI harms, and then how practitioners actually approach and enact them. And so in some ways, this comparison about how we theorize versus what people actually do is kind of quintessentially an inductive study, right? And so this is a good example. So one thought on the paper is moving that up earlier. So the theorizing would be, how do we think people, or what do we assume about people in the way that they enact AI ethics? And I'm going to do a study to see if this is not true or not, but like, what are the conflicting ideas about how people enact AI ethics? And that's going to inform my research questions, because we don't really know. There's different ideas from entrepreneurship literature. There could be work in values in design literature, like Katie Shilton at Maryland with her value levers of like, how do developers actually talk about these things? But she doesn't actually look at entrepreneurs only, right? Like she looks at more established companies. And so entrepreneurship could have something to say about how we think and talk about design, within AI. And so there's these different theories that would inform my research questions, because I would say in general, at the point where it is right now, I wasn't sure the theory behind the research questions, like why this study? So what bodies of literature are we building on to try to develop the research questions around this particular study in AI ethics in practice? And I'll open it up to, in general, I think in the findings, in addition, like I always think about figures and tables, in your other paper, it has figures and tables and those types of things to help the reader actually see within the narrative of the findings, like, how am I to make sense of it? Like to help them make sense of the findings, to say, these are the major ideas or concepts that we should take away that are theoretically generalizable to other areas, and not just these entrepreneurs, if that makes sense. Because there's a lot of good quotations and good ideas coming out of it, but it's not clear from the reading right now, what should we be taking out of this? And I'll just stop there just to get more feedback, because I have others that I can mention about it. But the main idea is that by looking at exactly how AI ethics is being talked about and enacted in practice, really should inform the way we're also theorizing about it. And that's the beauty of this type of research. So I don't know if you want to say anything to also kind of help explain what's going on.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much. Personally, I really appreciate it. And I also appreciate Ryan and the whole team of WeRobot for putting together this wonderful conference. And it's great to see you all in person after such a long time apart. Okay, I'm just gonna say one thing first. I told you yesterday. I wrote this when I was very sick with COVID. So if parts of this appear like a fever dream, that's true. I very much appreciate your comments, specifically the one about literature, research question, and kind of, questions around my own theorizing that flow from that. That's very, very productive. for me. So about why the Germans. So the study that funded or funds this research is funded by the German government, and it's based at the University of Tübingen, their Holden affiliation. And what I originally wanted to do is try and understand the whole cultural, technological, social ecosystem of AI startups, specifically in Germany, as a nation that has a very distinct relationship to engineering and technology and innovation. I signed my contract in January 2020, and I was supposed to do a lot of ethnographic research, which I couldn't do because of the pandemic. So it shifted very much towards these longer interviews and was much less a study of the actual ecosystem and much more really deep conversations about ethics. What do you mean by ethics? And so in that sense, it's really a mapping study of that. And the framing comes from the empirical framing. It comes from a deep interest in, I'm a native German, in that kind of, in the culture and those cultural relationships. I fully take on board that I need to think more deeply about that now that it's basically done and I'm writing about it and what that means and what literatures I should engage with. Vis-a-vis that, I will say one other thing about the Germans, which is that what came out of this research also were these very distinct principles that I talk about. So I talk about Miteinander in this one. In the fact paper, I talk about Mitbestimmung, co-determination. And I also use the social practice theory framework to dig into questions around how history and culture frame understandings of ethics and technology vis-a-vis AI specifically. And Germany has a very fraught relationship with technology through the Holocaust. And some of that actually came through in the data, which completely surprised me. So there is actually a relationship to Nazi morality, which I haven't spoken about publicly or written about yet, but that's going to take care of the German side of things in future publications.
I was actually thinking, I think there's good reasons to say that you're theorizing about, even the language that's offered, that the words aren't the words that we would use in English, right? Like, so there's like a translation, so I can see that how it will be informed by Germany. Yeah, so that's great.
Then, of course, moving up the conflicts between, existing literatures and what is on the ground, I think is also very productive. And I thought about flipping, you write a paper and then you kind of think about, okay, what audience am I targeting and do I need to flip things around? And then it should have been flipped. I ran out of steam at the end of it, quite literally, unfortunately. But let me maybe share what I wanted to kind of broadly do with this paper, which connects a lot of work, some of that theorizing, some of that conceptual work is, comes out of 10 years of working on design and inequality. So there's a lot there, but basically what I think is important for this crowd, which is a policy crowd, I think ultimately very much, albeit an STS one, is that I'm profoundly trying to bring sociological concepts and sociological thinking into the space. I think sociology is a little bit absent currently in this space. I wanted to bring empirical material onto people's desks and get people to read about what the folks on the ground think and what they do and how they interpret these things. And so I'm just grateful for the fact that I got into this conference and some of you read my paper and we got there to develop a culture for that. And then the third thing that I'm trying to do ultimately, which is a broader agenda that I have, is work towards practice-oriented policy approaches. So trying to understand what are various carriers of practice, how do those relate to technology and the professions, because essentially policies or changes through policy come into effect through non-policy actors always. And so I think we need to develop a better and more structured understanding when we do policy, when we talk policy ourselves. And so it's important that we consider the effects that can have as not, just a set goal that we work towards, although that's important when we talk about compliance, right, and standards and all of these things, but maybe also make space for considering the fact that these are moving targets always, and there's like an agility in the field that we kind of are missing. And I think my hope is that this kind of research can change that a little bit. I can talk more about that, but that's kind of a little bit more of the context for this work.
That's great. So I'll open it up if anyone has any comments or questions. I feel like we should arm wrestle or something.
Hi. Thanks for a great paper. I enjoyed it. Some of the stuff I was thinking has already just been covered, including why Germany, and my own sort of musings about the impact of World War II on people's perception of ethics and honor in my own dealings with lots of friends in Germany and colleagues. So I'm not surprised you found what you did. And I just wanted to tell you about a paper that a friend of mine who's finishing up his PhD at NYU Stern School of Business, his mentor, Professor Rob Siemens, also at Stern, and James Besson, who's at, I think, Boston University School of Law. It's called Ethical AI Development, Evidence from AI Startups. And I'm not sure about geography. I apologize, I don't remember that. It may have just been in the United States, but they surveyed 225 startups and found that 58% of those startups actually had ethical principles that they had implemented. Now, whether they actually really used them or lived up to them, that's another story, and I will leave it to you as the reader to discover. But they did find some pretty interesting things that if startups had data sharing relationships with like big tech firms that had a lot of experience with complying with GDPR, they were more likely to actually use the principles they had implemented. Now, whether that's because they, wanted to be an attractive target for acquisition, and understanding that big firms would actually want you to be ethical. I'm not sure the why, but I just thought you might enjoy the paper and be able to use it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sue. I really appreciate it. I've come across it. I will delve into it deeper. You brought up one important distinction, though, which give me a second to geek out empirically, sociologically. The distinction between what people say and what they do, right? And so I think that's an important methodological question that we have to ask ourselves as well as we engage in policy conversations, right? What can we actually observe and document and analyze, and what evidence do we have of actual practice versus people just, repeating what they think people want to hear. And so the interesting bit about startups is that they are so small and so resources strapped that they have to make very hard decisions about what they do and where they put their resources. And so they're very articulate about, even if you can't go in and observe, they will tell you, we can do this, but we can't do that. And here's why, because they have to really think about it. And that's why they're a potent place methodologically to look at that.
I've been musing about this for actually a few years. Seattle U out here, the not just the law school, several of the schools started a program for entrepreneurs, basically to teach them the ethics of artificial intelligence. And from casually things that folks have said to me, it that people doing startups, it's a younger generation, and a more they want more likely to want to do the right thing, whether they just say they want to do the right thing or they truly believe in it. Of course, as you point out, that's definitely a thing. But, and then the other thing that what you said kind of prompted me to wonder is, well, okay, we'd like firms, startups to be living these principles, but is espousing them the first step toward living the principles? At least are they pausing before they take the potentially unethical action, and they're at least doing it knowingly instead of, sort of randomly and blindly. So anyway, yeah, you give me lots of interesting things to ponder, and thank you for that.
Thank you, Sue.
So thanks to the paper it was fascinating. I really enjoyed it. The thing that jumped out at me most was I didn't expect to see the big ethical principle being much more of a process principle than something that's kind of externally focused or product focused, or kind of the way that the product works when it's out in the world. So I found that fascinating. And I'm curious if you have explicit, as you said, where the ethical rubber meets the road, like thoughts of how this sort of dominant process ethics as like a really important aspect should think away or should influence the way that policymakers try to act in this space. So in particular, I'm wondering if there are things you think this is a great idea that we wouldn't have thought of if Miteinander hadn't been a dominant factor here. Or alternatively, are there interventions that might seem like this is a great way to try to intervene to improve ethics of AI development, but actually it's a terrible idea because this is what's going on in this context, and there would be a really problematic interaction?
Thank you, Nicholas. That's a fantastic question. And it kind of directly connects to kind of the ultimate goal to develop some sort of practice-oriented policy approach, which asks the same question, which is what kind of elements within the stabilization of a practice do we want to encourage or discourage or support or not support? So I think one of the main learnings with this particular principle, being together, Miteinander, is that people need time to, ponder ethics and engage with them. And so that was a surprising finding for me, partially because, especially in Europe, and my German colleagues and European colleagues might agree or disagree, there's a lot of regulation already in place, which means we're talking compliance, we're talking checking boxes and all of that. And despite that, there was this very strong sociality to it that was expressed in that way. So I think knowing about that the employer relations and employee relations are actually critical for ethics in general, not just when we're in crisis mode, as we've seen over the past years in the tech industry, with ethics teams being fired and so on, is an important cue, right? Like, how do we think about employee-employee relationships? For example, what kinds of resources can we provide for people to consider things? What kind of investments can we make in, for example, transparent decision-making processes, which are, and that's in the fact paper and the co-determination paper about more transparent decision-making in companies, regardless how big or small they are, and how can we work with workers' councils on that, which again is a much more established thing in Germany. So it is about asking that question, right? Like, how can we think about that vis-a-vis the AI and tech startup sector in Europe specifically? And then very quickly, you can think about, VC cultures that are specific to Europe and Germany. I don't know if that answers your question, but it is essentially with Miteinander, I think it's a lot about employee-employee relationships.
Thank you for the paper. It was very interesting. And I think that sort of the project is certainly very valuable. Let me give you a reaction I had to the paper, and then perhaps a diagnosis of the reaction. So the reaction is this. I'm reading a paper about AI ethics, and then the particularities of the paper don't meet my expectations. It's like I was reading a paper about bioethics, and it was all about hospital culture and social norms among hospital staff. And there was nothing in the paper about what would traditionally be conceived as bioethics. So the word ethics is ambiguous. A standard definition in philosophy adopted in many legal contexts is that ethics is about all things considered reasons for action. There are various views about what these kinds of reasons are. There's Kantian ethics and utilitarian ethics and virtue ethics. But the paper is talking about ethics as a cultural phenomenon. And of course, ethics has a cultural dimension. So there are beliefs about ethics. There are social norms, and social norms have relationships to ethics. There are dispositions to behave in various ways, and those dispositions have ethical implications. But as ethics is understood in other disciplines, those beliefs, dispositions, and norms are not ethics. And if you're studying them, you're not studying AI ethics. So there might be a methodological issue here. And it has to do with the fact that you're not doing participant observation, but you're doing interviews. So, participant observation goes back to Peter Winch in the late 1950s. And it's based on Wittgensteinian understandings about how we get meaning. And so what people say is easily misunderstood, right? And so doing interviews might lead to a misleading picture of what's going on with ethics. Sort of the deep structure of ethical thinking in these organizations might not be captured by the interviews. It might be that a deeper understanding is required. And sort of that's what you get out of participant observation. I don't mean to in any way question your basic point about methodological pluralism, which seems to me absolutely right. And I don't want to question the value of this work. It seems to me it's just very valuable. But there might be other stuff going on that might have been uncovered by a different methodology. Sort of on the implications of this, the Miteinander concept and the context in which you do the study might sort of obscure questions of ethics in the philosophical or legal sense that have to do with relationships with strangers, right? So we have ethical duties to people who are not in the workplace. And if you focus on what goes on in the workplace, you might miss those ethical duties. Nonetheless, I think that this is very valuable work because if we're going to have ethical standards for artificial intelligence, they have to be implemented. They have to be a practice. That part of the paper, it seems to me, is absolutely correct. And so they have to be implemented. We have to take into account workplace culture. But in order to do that, it seems to me that we need to go beyond observations about sort of what the social norms are within organizations and figure out how to study how to do norm engineering in contexts that involve obligations towards strangers. I love the paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this wonderful diagnosis and comment. I was actually waiting for a comment like that. So let me, if you don't mind, respond to that. So there is a somewhat stubborn resistance to delving too deep or at all into philosophical discussions around ethics, partially because they've been around in our space for a good long while, and I do think that it is important to acknowledge existence and significance, but also to say, and or ask what social science and this idea of ethics as profound social practice can bring. So that's a little bit deliberate. I, again, fully agree on the problem of doing versus saying and the significance of participant observation. Absolutely. I will say, though, or add to that, that how folks create meaning or articulate meaning of AI ethics in these interviews definitely somewhat reflects what they do, and they talk about what they do, and different people from the same organization describe these processes. So it is kind of as close as I could get, but absolutely it would be needed to actually go in and look at the processes. Then you said a very interesting thing about how do we engineer values, or how do we engineer things like compliance, and I kind of want to push back against that a little bit, because I think one of the points I'm trying to make is for the policy audience is that that is maybe the wrong way to think about this, because we can't just top-down engineer those. These are very complex cultural, social, economic organizations and ecosystems that operate in these distinct contexts. Some of these are, you know, nationalist, like there are some geopolitics also that you can observe here very much. And so thinking about more nonlinear ways of maybe manipulating professional practice with a distinct ethical or policy goal might be more productive. So a more granular approach. What kinds of materials and meanings do we have to change so we can actually get these folks to adopt these things, thinking that they came up with it themselves, if you will. But thank you so much for your very kind comments and productive feedback. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, so this opens for me a big can of worms discussion within tech policy generally, and more specifically on the role of the social sciences in informing policy. Okay, so Professor Martin knows this very well, but in the privacy literature, there are two deep dives into whether or not what corporations are doing around privacy compliance is effective and effectual. And the first one is Privacy on the Ground by Deirdre Mulligan and Ken Bamberger. And Ken Bamberger. I always get the Bambauers and the Bambergers. It's Bamberger. Don't tell Ken I said that. Bamberger, and it's a really deep dive. I mean, it's somewhat of a mixed methods approach. It is grounded theory in the sense that a term I learned from Meg Jones like 8 years ago, but it's you know, now I'm an expert, and it's grounded theory and so on. It's qualitative in nature, and it comes to the conclusion of, you know what, it's working. You know what I mean? Like, you know, counterintuitively, you know, all this compliance stuff has really gotten seeped into the culture, and, you know, really, even though there's no laws, like, you know, it's working, and you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised how much compliance there is out there privacy wise. And everyone's like, oh, my goodness, maybe it's working just fine. Then the other shoe drops, and that shoe is a very nice shoe, usually very tasteful shoe by Ari Waldman, right? And Ari drops this mega sort of, you know, thesis. It takes him 10 years to do this. He does this deep dive into corporate culture, industry unbound. He does mixed methods. He does grounded theory. He's there. He's you know, he's looking at participation. He's asking questions. He's doing, you know, semi-structured interviews. What does he conclude? Well, lo and behold, doesn't work at all. Doesn't work at all. There's a kind of a cynical, you know, it's partly by accident, partly sort of benign neglect, partly malicious neglect. You know what I mean? It's this whole thing, right? And but his conclusion is it is not working. We need to be top down. We need to be regulatory. So if you're a regulator, right, are we just kind of back to legal realism, right? Where you're just kind of picking and choosing whatever evidence you believe, you know what I mean? You believe the Brandeis brief, great. If you believe whatever the opposite of Brandeis brief is, you can draw from that, right? In other words, how is a policymaker to navigate an increasingly rich empirical space where there are conflicting accounts of whether a particular strategy is working? And how do you, as an empirical scholar interested in policy, situate yourself within a debate like that?
Thanks, Ryan, for the shoes. I mean, that is the big question, right? Like, what are we even doing here and why are we doing it? And what can we contribute to that? First off, I would say, I don't think that it's one or the other. It's, top down versus bottom up ever. I don't think that that's a good approach. Personally, and I did ask Margaret that way yesterday about, I think the professions play a really important and underdeveloped role in getting this stuff on the ground, meeting in the middle. Professional practice, professional identity. We spoke about discretion, professional discretion yesterday. I think could be a sweet spot where we can forge very productive alliances. And I do hope that we are able to focus on that a little bit more as we see more and more omnibus regulation, come from the other side of the pond. As to how I situate myself in that, personally, I would argue I'm a very public scholar and try to just bring folks into conversations in public events. I think working with journalists actually is important, and I would encourage every scholar to explore that, even though it can be draining and disappointing sometimes. And I think the classroom is a very important site for that work, because our students are always, 1, 2, maybe 3 years away from becoming professionals themselves. And then just when it comes to bringing empirical material into the space, just keep telling the stories. As a trained ethnographer, I would say that's basically the main mission, and bringing the richness, and kind of, do so on repeat. Thank you for your question.
I do think that it's interesting to say that AI ethics looks different than we think. Like when it's enacted in practice, we think of it as principles and checklists. And although we don't think of it that way, but like some people are arguing for that. But when you talk to especially entrepreneurs, they talk differently about their business. That we know from entrepreneurship literature. And the way they make decisions is different than established companies. They also don't have a general counsel's office with a compliance checklist. They just don't have that. And so the way that they talk about it is different. And so when we're making policies, you don't want to go the Ari Waldman route. I mean, not Ari, it's like what he found, where it's a checklist and they are asked, we should all be like Ari Waldman, but like would they have a checklist and then they're not invited to meetings? I mean, that's literally what happened. And you're saying that like there's other ways, and your professionalization is a great meeting in the middle piece of it. And I'll just add the other question about, I think one thing that would help the reader or the reviewer, that's who you have to worry about next, is review number 2. Like who are those people, the 64? Because like if it's only the top executive at these different companies, that's very different than like 8 people within 8 companies. Because then you are kind of triangulating what's going on, or the executive brainwashed all other 7. But I mean, that won't happen, right? So I think that having that type of understanding will help people see that it's a little bit more participant observation, more so than just interviews and surveys type of thing. Yeah. So, go ahead.
I always appreciate an exercise in comparative ethics. And I thought this was so interesting. It was really great insight. And there's more and more of this empirical research coming out that allows for us to see some differences. I read the article, I don't think on purpose, but as an instructor, as a teacher who is increasingly training students who go in and bear almost the entire weight of the ethical energy of these organizations. Some of them are startups and those are different. And so this question you might have a limited response to this, but a lot of times they'll be the embedded ethicist at a company on a specific team and they don't last long. Or they'll join a team at a big company and they'll have a different role to play. But I'm wondering what takeaways you think I should make from this paper as a teacher, as somebody who's training people, I guess two questions. What should they know going in to these environments? And what should they be asking for? Like, what do you see that maybe would make them more successful? And so for us, our students do then become more important and gain more power. And so I guess I'm kind of asking, what can we do to push from the bottom and from the top? Like, what are maybe two simple things that you would take away from your study that could help us train students?
Thank you so much for that question. I always love talking about student success in in their future careers. What should they know going in? I think one thing you said yourself, it's hard, because, coming out of the school where we kind of effortlessly talk about this, and that's just a very stark difference to how it actually unfolds in practice. And it doesn't matter if that's a startup or an established organization. So I think, a disclaimer is extremely important. I think what they should also know and be able to do is connect, be able to understand macro phenomena and understand what those mean on the ground and speak that language and be kind of ready to make arguments using that, right? So yeah, we all talk about inequity, we all talk about inequality, we all, talk about these big concepts, but what does it actually mean on the ground for this specific situation, conversation that they're having, workplace that are in, which brings me to the second question, which is what should they be asking for? I think they should be asking for at least being participants, Lawrence just said that, and in conversation around product, strategy, and so on. So being, understanding how the own organization, because there are embedded social scientists in a way, right? Understanding how the organization thinks about these things, ascribes meaning to materials, processes, and so on, to make a better argument. And that's something I've learned in my other research that I'm doing on AI audits, for example, or things such as procurement. Applicability, you asked about tables and illustrations, is the key thing. Being able to connect macro to micro and then segue to application, I think is kind of the sweet spot. Means extra work, extremely, extremely tiring. So I think, asking for resources and of course, resources and support is important. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what have learned so far. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Mona. All right, so first I'll say, as somebody who's part of the shoes conversation that Ryan laid out earlier, that I actually don't look to pieces like this as being proof in one way or another. And I don't think that's your role nor what you have to do. I understand this as like an ethnography that's a story of what's happening. It's not, maybe at some point down the line, it becomes a data point in a discussion of how you make organizations effective, but I don't understand that as being the purpose of the paper nor what you're trying to do. What I would love to hear, so I have questions and a question or a request and some musings. My question or request is, I would like to hear your version of the Hicks story of this paper, right? Like when I got to that part of the paper, I thought, okay, so she's got practices, she's got objects, she's got principles. I forget what the third one is in the diagram. And like what she's trying to get at is this story of how the coffee cooler, water cooler conversation is a practice that we have to be talking about when we're talking about the object, right? Or we're talking about the principles meet practices meet the object. But I need that through line for you. So that's my request or my question, like tell me the Hicks story. And then on the musings, it's interesting, especially given the question that you asked yesterday. I don't understand this as being a study about professionalism at all. It's actually almost about like the fabric of the organization that's not the professionals. I think you are, in a hard spot of trying to talk about what being together is through the top individuals, somewhat like what Lawrence was saying, the top individuals of an organization while not being together with them. So that's a hurdle to this project. And I'm sad you didn't get to do the on the ground work. And I think what would make it more successful for me in coming in as an outsider to this discipline would be if in the parts of the paper where, and this is, not your professional sort of practice in writing these kinds of papers, but the parts of the paper where you're talking about the ethical principles, you could say, more directly, here are what people usually name as ethical principles around AI, human-centric, fairness, blah, blah, blah. But where the rubber meets the road in this social practice theory is that you can't talk about those principles in the abstract. You need to be talking about who these people are socially practicing ethics and what they think it means to be in an ethical organization. And then you can leave it to those of us who are playing around with the regulators and regulatory design to be like, well, what the heck do I do with that, right? Like, I have this organization where you have a bunch of employees who are talking around the water cooler about how they believe in equality. I mean, according to their bosses, this is what they're doing. They believe in equality, but equality means we're race blind, right? Or equality means, women in the workplace who are not pregnant should be treated as, men in the workplace, right? Like, those are very big assumptions about what equality means. And you can't put meaning to the principles of the regulatory framework unless you know that that's where you're landing when you're coming into organizations. All right, that was my question. Am I amusing?
We have like only a minute, like we're gonna run over. So I don't know if we can let the one last question. Oh, okay, that's fine. But then we can go ahead.
Thank you, Margot. I love those comments. Yes, to the Hicks story. The Hicks story and social practice musings, those are my musings, right? Around, okay, how can I actually explain how social practice theory is, very useful and productive, and using their fantastic work. Yes, I will do that. And I was very glad to hear that, said, well, leave it, sometimes it's enough to give the story, and then people in other fields can take that material, which is always a mission, of course, of ethnographic work, is that material lives on if you were. So thank you for that.
So I'm not sure the event would be complete without someone saying my question is actually more of a comment. So I will start there. I love this paper and I want to lend some support to its importance. Most of what I'm going to say, Mona, I think you probably already know because we've talked about that, but hopefully this will be useful to the rest of the room. Culture in this context, it's the only thing that matters. It's really, it's the only thing. Product group leaders in tech companies and technical work group leaders in vertical industries have a lot to think about. Budget constraints, headcount constraints, a feature list to implement, growing bug list, privacy reviews for GDPR compliance, accessibility reviews if there's a UX tier, security reviews. And then along comes an AI ethics person that says, hey, here's a checklist you need to go through. Here's an impact assessment. And it's just more work that gets in the way of shipping the product. There's no demand for it. Nobody's asking for this. Which is why I think Ari Waldman found so much performative compliance in his ethnography study. People, the river finds a way around the rocks. If success is getting the product out the door on time, under budget, you'll find a way to do that because these are work group leaders under enormous business pressure. So I think the remedy for that is culture transformation led at the senior most executive levels of the company. In the case of startups, it's the board, it's the investors, it's the people with that level of influence. Bottoms up is great. I think it's necessary but not sufficient. A lot of these companies have fate groups and captive groups inside trying to agitate the system from within. I don't think they do harm, but they rarely succeed their goals in transforming the culture from the bottom up. So I just wanted to thank you for writing this. I have some coffee chit chats with private equity pals coming up sometime in the fall. And I just, the purpose of those, my kind of agenda there is to impress upon them the importance of thinking about this as an early stage venture, rather than taking on all this ethical debt and then dealing with it after they go to market. And I just didn't really have any ammo. This is the kind of stuff that helps me do that. Sue, thank you as well. I did not know about the best papers. I've found those links and downloaded them. This is exactly the kind of ammo I need to motivate those discussions. So I'd love to see more of this kind of scholarship. The one thing missing, I think, from this domain is just more scholarly research into culture. That's the big missing link for me. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. I think that was great, closing.
I would, to your point, there is a lot of work on entrepreneurship and ethics, has nothing to do with AI, absolutely nothing, right? And like one of my colleagues from my PhD program, Nick Du, he's at the Naval graduate school out in Monterey. Advisor was Sarah Sarasvathy, does effectuation, which is a non-economic version of entrepreneurship, where it's all about entrepreneurs. That's all they have is their culture because they don't have any resources. And so it's a really interesting space to look at. And it'd be super interesting to bring that ethics and entrepreneurship literature into the AI area, because it just hasn't been done. Because even the NYU study doesn't engage with that work because they're not in entrepreneurship as a field. So I think you're right. I think it's really great to talk about culture and entrepreneurship, and your paper is a great step in that direction in doing that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for
Yeah.
these terrific comments. Thank you, everybody. Very much appreciate all your questions and comments and giving space. And I feel enriched and rejuvenated to take this next step with this paper. Thank you so much.
Thanks. What a great panel. Yeah. And so I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our panel. So first of all, as I've done first in each case, I'm introducing our discussant, and our discussant needs no introduction. But of course, it is Woody Hartzog from Boston University, who is, as you all know, one of the most prolific, impactful, influential scholars in the law and technology space, including around robotics and artificial intelligence law. And so thank you very much, Woody, for doing this. Daniela DiPaolo is a PhD candidate in personal and service robots at the famed MIT Media Lab, and was one of the students who worked on Jibo, a very well-known robot that was immediately able to spot Jibo in the robot trivia thing. She gave it away, but in her excitement, she did shed some information for other people about that. But obviously, that was a remarkable accomplishment. That robot was, is and was an incredible thing to work on. And we also have some common interests, but I won't tell everybody what they are. So welcome. It's RuPaul's Drag Race, but anyway. And then there's some person named Kate. Just kidding. Then there's Kate Darling, who is one of our, of course, general chairs, and known all over the world for her expertise in social robotics, and of course has dual training. She has got legal training and has written on a very wide variety of contexts, but is all very, very well known to all of us here. So with that, I'll turn it over to Woody, and I'm really excited about this. Thanks a lot.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ryan. I really appreciate it. Welcome all. I am so excited for this panel. Two incredible scholars here for the paper, Lula Robot, Consumer Protection in the Face of Automated Social Marketing. Kate Darling and Daniela DiPaolo have done a really remarkable job. I think this is, if I'm being honest, this one of my favorite papers, my favorite paper at this conference, and one of the past few. I love this paper, not the least because they cite me in the epigram. And so everything in this paper is right, and we should just go ahead and go to questions. I'm kidding. Obviously, the short version of this paper, just to summarize it, is we come here to bury transparency for social robots, not to praise it. The longer version of this paper is that we are on course for a direct collision between new forms of marketing that leverage automation and anthropomorphization to persuade a uniquely vulnerable population to buy things and to click things and to do things. And our rules for this sort of practice that are supposed to protect a unique population too frequently boil down to transparency. Let's just do some disclosures, and choice. We should give people some choices. These rules are woefully inadequate, and I completely agree. So to briefly summarize, the authors start by introducing us to the concept of automated social marketing. I'll come back to that concept in a little bit, but as they conceive of it, it combines elements of traditional advertisements like entertainment media, traditional person-to-person marketing, and I think that the relational and social element is a really key part of this. This is like door-to-door sales or Tupperware parties, influence marketing like Instagram, celebrity endorsements, traditional personalized ads like shoe ads on social media after you've been talking about Ari Waldman's shoes for a little while. And all of these things sort of come together in a way that is a uniquely potent and dangerous cocktail, I think, as the way that the authors conceive of it. And they draw upon their own prolific and important research, as well as the research of others in the HRI space and those who are doing persuasive robotics research to make the arguments that this concept of automated social marketing is unique, not only, I think, socially, but legally. And this is really where I will want to sort of start giving some feedback on some of the aspects of the paper. For the rest of the paper, they go into what the rules are for advertisements generally in the United States. They focus specifically on the Federal Trade Commission, which is in the United States, the regulatory body that polices unfair and deceptive trade practices, which includes commercials. They also focus on some specific rules and frameworks around advertising to children, a uniquely vulnerable population, which has been recognized for in several areas of the law as a uniquely vulnerable population to persuasion and other sorts of messages. And I really liked how you built that out a little. And I think that and then you go into sort of the limits of transparency, because you note that the Federal Trade Commission generally, the remedy has been, well, as long as we give a disclosure, then there's not going to be any major problem here, because then consumers, even if they're children, will know what's going on, right? And in the case of the research that you draw upon, you are uniquely worried about the way in which we put social meaning into robots, right? As though robots have emotion and care about our interests, and we are sort of uniquely vulnerable to that. And the way that advertising law has traditionally handled that is, by the way, you know that this is an ad, right? So when a social robot says, you look down today, would you like to try a Fanta, right? And by the way, this is an ad, just so you know. Then that's the way that we handle that. For many of you probably on Twitter have seen the little promoted, tag. That's a form of a disclosure, or you see the very long list of disclosures in advertisements for pharmaceuticals, which is like, this is the greatest pharmaceutical in the world. It could kill you 17 different ways, but right. And then they sort of disclose it. There are two sort of major contributions I see already in this piece, even though we had conversations, and I think that you hope to continue building out this piece. You've got some more things you want to do. The first is, I think that this does a fantastic job of getting existing research, your own research and the research of others in the HRI space about persuasive robotics into the discussion for policymakers. And so the Federal Trade Commission particularly is looking, and I loved your sort of crying out for help nudge in the paper. And this is already, I think, a very great contribution, because we have a lot of discussions in the regulatory space, things like dark patterns, which is another discussion around persuasive technologies. These are user interfaces that try to trick people into doing things or persuade you into doing things. And that sort of has now percolated up to the FTC at this point, and they're thinking about it.
Thanks to you.
Thanks to a whole lot of people who have done some incredible dark patterns research. And there are still, I think, they haven't yet made it to social robots yet. And at all, right? And so I think that this is a really important intervention. But there's another important intervention, I think, embedded in this paper. And it makes me, and this is where I'll start my feedback a little bit, it makes me want to know a little bit more about what you want to do with the paper, because The second contribution that I see in this paper is a case study that might just break the idea of disclosures as a method of consumer protection. And I think that the part of this paper where you start digging into the research that shows that even when you fully disclose to people that what sort of is going on, right? So many of our discussions at WeRobot have to do with, or algorithms and AI generally have to do with, well, if we just know what's in the black box, or we just know how it functions, and lawmakers don't know how the robots function. And we had a whole workshop based on helping give light to the idea about the ways that these robots function. And your thesis here is even when they know, they are not immune from the effects of persuasion that you might see if they were being deceived. And I think that's a really profound thing to push on. And so you can, my first comment is you can back into this paper two different ways. I think you can frame this paper two different ways. The first is you could actually make this a paper about the problem of manipulation with social robots and how that our consumer protection laws generally, not just the FTC, but broadly speaking, have yet to confront the nature of this problem. And there are models for legal papers that do this. And I think WeRobot has been, you know, if we can claim as a community credit for this, I think WeRobot has been pretty good about combining a lot of the empirical and social science research and helping sort of facilitate a policy conversation about that. And if you do that, I would love to see digging into this really difficult question of when legally is manipulation wrongful. And this would put you in conversation with Kirsten Martin, who just commented on the previous panel, who wrote an excellent paper on manipulation and choice, and Helen Nissenbaum and Daniel Susser's work about manipulation as hidden influence, and sort of thinking about how might we, because you started this work, how might we identify with specificity at what point a emotional companion robot, which has advertised, has crossed the line, right? Or if that's even possible, because I also love some of the potential interventions that you float in the paper, which I'll get to in a second. The other possible way you could frame this paper is, in fact, the straw that broke the disclosure's camel's back, right? So disclosure as a approach to consumer protection has been under strain for quite some time. We all now pretty clearly recognize that the I agree button is farcical, that there are all sorts of things that we just gloss over. And I wonder if you might say this, in fact, is the case study that should give us pause about the entire endeavor and maybe consider moving, calling something inherently unable to, one of the things that you get into is you say, maybe we should treat social robots with respect to marketing as inherently deceptive, which I thought was really interesting. And as a potential regulatory strategy, I'd love to see you unpack a little more. I had a couple of other questions around the idea of manipulation and persuasion. One of the things that came up as you continue to build out is what is the role of desensitization or acclimation here? And so a lot of the research talks about if the robot discloses something, then it doesn't seem to have any effect. Is there any potential different effect over time if you keep doing it, right? Like, will it eventually seep in, or would it work the other way, where it might work at first and then be less effective over time? And so there's some really interesting stuff that you might want to unpack there. But if you do go the route of the actual disclosures sort of are fundamentally broken route with this paper, then you would be engaging with some of the workarounds, remedying information asymmetries, and how does that work, and sort of fundamental questions around consumer protection, which has long relied upon the idea that the way that we protect consumers is we remedy information asymmetries. So you just say that this isn't going to work. Okay, so just a few other quick things, and then we can go to questions. I will say that I struggled a little bit with the concept of automated social marketing. And it may just be because all three of those words already have meanings that I didn't necessarily morph onto social robots, which I take what you're talking about is embodied, which you talk a lot about, anthropomorphized, some sort of form of anthropomorphization. And so I wonder if there's a way, maybe we can sort of brainstorm it here and now, like what other sort of label might we ascribe to it? So the term itself didn't really, in my mind, intuitively describe what it was you were talking about. The other issue that I had with the concept was it actually wasn't clear to me fully what the boundaries of this concept was. And so I didn't know if you were talking about a sort of general problem or if you were proposing a specific set of practices that are relatively ascertainable that might be a proper target for regulation. And if that's the case, I could have used just a little more, maybe some examples, right? So I love some of the examples, but I think building that out would be a little more effective. And then the last point I wanted to talk about is you invoke the Federal Trade Commission as your major sort of regulatory body. And I love tackling the FTC. Of course, you know that now there is a call for rulemaking, comments, the ANPR around commercial surveillance and data security. I think this actually would fit right in. And I think that making the case that persuasive social robots should be considered part of this conversation is a really important contribution. If you do tend to go down that route, there are two interesting things to try to unpack. One is this really interesting question is, are social robots actually deceptive when they are fully giving disclosure? In other words, is the harm from anthropomorphized and social robots that they are pretending to be something they're not, and we just can't get it across, like even the disclosures will not have us in a proper mindset to understand the nature of the interaction? Or is it that they are actively leveraging some kind of compulsion, right? That is not necessarily about our proper mindset, but rather a set of behaviors or responses that we just in a very deep way respond to. And if that's the case, then deception might not be the right word, given the FTC's jurisprudence on deception. Maybe what we're talking about, and you explore this idea, is that it's unfair. This is unfair design, that there are, maybe it's unfair persuasion, which of course then gets us into, and what I'd love to see a little more discussion around is, if we're talking about unfairness, and we're talking about that whole area for the FTC, which has to do with the Balancing Act and consumer harm. And I would love to see, there's room in this paper, I think, to build out a discussion around the KidVid episodes where the FTC considered labeling advertisements to kids for sugary cereals as an unfair trade practice, and it almost got the FTC defunded entirely, right? Based on a similar sort of idea that kids are cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. And that is something that's a similar sort of compulsion. And I wonder, as you focus on the specific affordances of social robots, to use the term, just so that Ryan would be like, yeah, I like to use that word, this is something that you could do to bring in a lot of what the FTC is likely to do, because I think that the shadow of KidVid still looms large at the Federal Trade Commission, that the idea that they're careful about not wanting to push it too far. And so you're going to have a pretty solid amount of evidence that there is some sort of compulsion. I think you can do that. That's one of the benefits of the papers, but you will have to focus on notions of harm and tackling that harm question. And then there is more areas. So one of the things that you do in this paper is you sort of play within the existing framework of the FTC, which is right. Those are the rules that we have. That's what you said to do in your paper. Right. It is. No, it's true. That was 7 years ago, me, and now I come to. So one of the things that there's room to do in this paper is you don't need to be bound by the FTC. You could. There is a lot of legislation that is being proposed now that changes the authority of the FTC, that grants them specific rulemaking authority. You could draw on other consumer protection frameworks, because I think that that what this paper is really a great consumer protection paper. You could draw from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's authority to regulate abusive trade practices, which strikes me, and I wrote this in the unfairness paper, but which strikes me as uniquely designed to target companies that try to leverage people's vulnerabilities and sort of natural responses that leaves them vulnerable when companies try to leverage those against people themselves. And so it's a really interesting way you could explore some of the things that are happening within the EU with the AI Act. You could look into lots of other kinds of frameworks, and let's take a stroll into the Bad Ideas Lounge, maybe near the end, and say, why don't we just ban all advertisements for social robots, right? If it's going to be interacting with children, no ads, right? And what would that give us, right? And we can sort of work through, okay, well, that will create some things as well. It changes business models. And then at the end, you talk about trust. And anytime I read the word trust, I'm like, yes, that's where it's at. And Neil Richards' ears will perk up. There have been proposed within various pieces of legislation, ideas of data loyalty that would require companies to design technologies in the best interests of the people that are using them. And I think that this is a viable idea about a way to make sure that these anthropomorphized social robots are done in a way that has to serve our interests. And the benefit of thinking about loyalty as a potential way to combat this problem is that loyalty doesn't just look at harm. Loyalty looks at the benefit that is flowing to the company that is designing the robot or using the robot. And that helps us see the disparities a little more, right? Or perhaps the incentive behind the decision. And so in short, I loved every word of this paper. I loved reading it. I can't wait to see where it goes next. Thank you for this important intervention. And I'll be delivering it to the next lawmaker that I talk to that's interested in this stuff. So thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. Just like on a meta level, one of the things I love most about We Robot is I originally come from the law and econ world where like the goal is just to tear each other's work apart in order to make it better. And I just find it's so much more impressive and difficult to take a draft like this and be like, here are the contributions that I see, and here's how you can make it better. It's just, so thank you so much. And it's why I love this conference. And it was just such an amazing and extremely helpful example of that. And I also love it because I don't think that so to speak to kind of the goals of the paper and the different directions we could take it in, I don't think that we ever thought that we were going to make like a huge scholarly contribution here, because I think we really felt like people have already made the argument that, anthropomorphized technology is going to be misused to manipulate people for corporate gain. I mean, Ian Kerr wrote about this like 13 years ago. You've written about this. Ryan has indicated. So that's kind of a known thing. And then the other known thing is that there's tons of privacy literature talking about how meaningful consent is, and Meg has done work on consent. So there's so much work on the ways that disclosure and transparency don't work in the digital age. And even though that's more focused on kind of the social media platforms and network effects, I think it's pretty easy to like make the next step to social robots and say, hey, that it's also not working here and might be even worse. So it's really cool to hear that you think that there might also be an avenue to talk about manipulation, and for that to be, because Daniela really wanted us to go into kind of what is deception, what is manipulation, and I was like, we don't have time for that. So I actually would love to do both. I think what we are trying to do is combine kind of the things that have already been said and use this specific use case in exactly the way you said, to be like, here is a really timely, salient, specific case that we can all get behind, that the FTC is currently like about to, the FTC is currently looking at things like unboxing videos and social media influencers, because they've realized, oh shit, all the research that we have is based on like television ads and kids. And we really need to be just changing everything for this new digital age, but they have not yet considered artificial characters really, or social robots. And so I think we feel like it's exactly the right time to come in with the work that's been done, tie in the HRI, HCI research, which is really what our expertise is in, and make the case to the FTC that there's something that they should be considering. So that's really our goal. And so, yeah, we'd like to do both. And maybe it's, a paper on manipulation and like a comment to the FTC on the other stuff. I don't know. We really just want to make a difference. So let's see. Oh yeah. And, the unfairness. Yeah. So I love how, because we come, well, I have an IP background, but I think our like real comparative advantage in this space is that we're intimately familiar with all of the literature and human robot interaction, human computer interaction. And like, Danielle has done some fantastic work on like specifically kids and social robots that really starts to show that it really doesn't matter what you tell people. It's not even just kids, like they're just gonna treat the robot, like a social actor anyway. And but we don't have any background in like consumer protection, in the consumer protection space. And so I think it would be really helpful to this was super helpful. Like saying that we don't need to stick to the FTC, like that's great. What else should we be considering? We have no idea. Like we were just like Googling the FTC stuff and being like, oh, we can make a public comment on this. That's cool. Like we should do that. So we have no idea really. So please help us. I didn't know what are abusive trade practices. What else should we be looking at? So that we really need your help with that. And what else? Oh, and I think you can probably speak more to this, but the desensitization thing is a big question. And part of the problem with the HCI and HRI research is that a lot of it is based on like one-time experimental like lab studies. And actually Daniela did one of the very first longer term studies where she put social robots in kids' homes for a longer period of time and showed that over time, it did not make a difference. So I think we do need more of that work. And another contribution that we are hoping to make is to lay out some of the research questions that would be really important for policymakers to get answered by the research community in order to have evidence-based policy in this space.
Great segue. Thank you, Wendy. So I just wanted to share a little bit about the motivation for this paper. Or my personal motivation. I was working with these 75 children who lived with robots for 2 months, and I did an activity with them at the end of the study in which they kind of sorted out, they were kind of bad ideas, like robots should advertise only through casual conversations, or robots should not advertise at all. And by and large, most children wanted robots to advertise to them through casual conversation. And
they had 3 options. Wait,
yeah, they had 3 options. So one was robots can advertise to me through casual conversation. Robots can't advertise to me at all. And robots can advertise to me if it's explicitly shown as an ad.
Disclosed.
If it's disclosed, basically. Yeah.
And what did they choose?
And they chose casual conversation by and large. And that was for reasons that they wanted the robot to know them. It was a way that the robot showed that it knew information about them and could relate to them. It was also another functionality that the robot could kind of possess, which I thought was interesting. But for me, I saw that as the most deceptive practice. And I was thinking that, 75% of these students had taken a class with me to learn about how the robot worked. So they knew how this robot worked, but yet they knew it was intentionally designed to be a character and be like a friend, and they still wanted the robot to use casual conversation with them. So that was kind of a big like aha moment, I think. And I also just want to comment on this idea of transparency, because we talk a lot about it. We've been talking a lot about it in like the legal context, but within robotics as well, transparency is kind of seen as the way to get around a lot of the issues that roboticists have already created. So like a lot of founders of artificial intelligence, including Marvin Minsky and Joseph Weizenbaum, like they advocated for education around these systems because that was the way that we were going to know that the systems were potentially behaving in deceptive ways. And in robotics, the whole, I guess, premise of using a robot for something is the idea that you're building a social relationship. We've seen over and over again is that like the more social something is, the better the outcomes are, whether those outcomes are learning outcomes or healthcare outcomes or whatever it might be. So we're saying at one time, we're saying we need to make this more deceptive because it works better. And on the other side, we're saying basically that we should make it less deceptive so people are aware of it. So I think there's this real tension between the two of them that we need to kind of look into.
All right, let's go ahead and go to, we've got a queue now. I don't know who came up first. I apologize. I think it was Margot.
Hi, this paper is great. I also would encourage you to move away from the use it as a vehicle to criticize notice and consent for a number of reasons. So first, there's actually a product of this conference from 2017 was not ever workshopped in this conference, but like this conference made it happen, was a piece that I did with Bill Smart and Cindy and Matt Rubin called Averting Robot Eyes. And that paper, in that paper, we came up with the term of honest anthropomorphism, which then Evan Selinger and Brenda Leong picked up and wrote Robot Eyes Wide Shut. And they have like a taxonomy of different kinds of dishonest anthropomorphism, which I think would be really helpful to you. So this includes what designers can abuse: human responses to body parts, human responses to body language, human responses to physical behavior, human responses to living beings, human responses to size, human responses to attractiveness, human responses to voice, to age, to personality, to agency, to identity, to localized intelligence, to sensory manipulation, and to mobility. So I think that will be an incredibly useful framework for you experts to build on, to basically be speaking to either the FTC or the CFPB or whoever it is, whatever hypothetical regulator you're speaking to say like, yup, all of that is right. Here are things they've left out. Here are the other ways in which we can really, deliberately use this particular type of anthropomorphic interface to manipulate children, because manipulating children is bad. And then they want you to buy things. I know, I have a 5-year-old. Lots of it's frozen. Yeah, that's in the movie, not as in cold. The other framework I wanted to point you to along the lines of like, don't just focus on notice and consent, would be COPPA. So there's an interesting piece by Zara Takshid, who's at Denver Law, called Children's Digital Privacy and the Case Against Parental Consent, which sort of talks about how the COPPA model of using the FIPS and landing control in parents is a terrible idea and doesn't work in practice. And because she's very pro privacy torts, says actually at the end, here's how we could revive the privacy torts to have causes of action against particularly bad children's privacy violations. Now that's somewhat of a pipe dream, but that's another option, right? You say, okay, you've designed your robot to be absolutely horrible and manipulative and taking advantage of children. It's fraud, maybe. I don't know enough about fraud, right? But like maybe there are various private causes of action that could be used against particular practices. You come up with guidelines that say what practices would constitute that. So be creative. Last thing I'll say is my end rant on transparency. So Jeff Auslis, Frank Pasquale, and I have each done a version of this recently, where we've been thinking about the ways in which we don't get transparency into the tech sector, and that individual disclosures can often be mechanisms for journalists' conversations about terrible things that then make those issues policy salient, that then turns into a political conversation about what exactly you want to regulate. So I just wouldn't throw out transparency, individualized transparency so quickly, because often absent a private sector FOIA, hi Meg, that was our bad idea at a previous conference. Absent a private sector FOIA, or absent class action litigation, it's one of the ways that we can get insight into practices in the way that, the experience of a technology diverges from the reality of technology. So please don't close off transparency. Great.
Great, great comments. Thank you so much. I wrote down everything, but I might come back to you. Yeah.
I think you absolutely have a scholarly contribution here. And here's one version of it. I mean, I think the work that you have done pulling together all of these things is in and of itself a scholarly contribution. This paper does not exist, yet. One of the things that I think you guys could especially do is help us readers understand the context in which children interact with social robots and their relationship to the rest of their environment. So you have a home where you maybe have a parent who maybe bought the social robot. That's one dynamic that maybe lends itself to a particular type of regulatory tool. But let's say you're somebody, for instance, who doesn't have technology in your house, but you send your kids to school. Is there a different regulatory mechanism that you might say, well, yeah, robots in schools should not be advertising to children? I think that's personally a great idea, but maybe that goes through the Department of Education, or maybe that goes through state level education departments, but maybe organizing the social landscape would be helpful. And then you could, on top of that, map the regulatory parties that you would engage with, and then you could sort of hand it off to the community to say, yeah, add this article to your list when you engage with those policymakers.
Yeah, that's especially interesting because the research group that we're in is currently doing so much work getting robots into schools. So.
Hi, I'm Sue Gluck from Microsoft. Love the paper. Kind of a lovely moment for me. My very first We Robot paper that I read was Who's Johnny by Kate. So thank you for, and that was in Seattle in 2015. So I feel like you've kind of brought it on home for me.
Yeah, I still have PTSD from the comments.
Well,
I
not
don't
for
know
me.
if anyone was here in Seattle, but when Ken Goldberg talked about the singularity for 10 minutes instead of commenting on the paper, that was pretty
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah. And that's why I didn't comment, because I was like, what is this? But yeah. Anyway, love the paper. Love that you opened with a Woody quote. The first thing I wrote down and then erased was that I was going to chastise you a little bit, that you opened with the wrong Woody quote. But of course, you got to the stuff about Rocco, the Roomba. And please, Daddy, if I don't have an upgrade, I will die, So very well played, And I don't know, was that your way of selecting who would be your discussant at We Robot by like, I'm
We
not
got
sure,
lucky.
but I thought that was awesome. So have you guys seen the Saturday Night Live sketch called More Cowbell? This is where, for people who may not know, it's a fictional account of the recording of Blue Oyster Cult's Don't Fear the Reaper. And Christopher Walken plays the music producer who keeps asking Will Ferrell for more cowbell, even though he's getting an obnoxious amount of cowbell. And so my advice to you is twofold: more cowbell. And Daniela was right. Although you already quote Ryan Calo, 3 different papers by Ryan Calo, I'm going to suggest a 4th. And that is Digital Market Manipulation. And I will send you a link to it because I looked it up. Ryan knows when I talk about that paper, I just call it the creepy paper because it'll creep you out. But I think Daniela's instinct was right to talk more about online manipulation. Woody gave you Daniel Sesser, Helen Niesenbaum, and some other person's paper also about that topic. And I can send you a link to that too, because I was going to say it before he scooped me. But no, I think that's a great, I know you're focusing more on papers about robots, but there's so much to learn in the online world of manipulation. So I think that's really a great way to go. I also think I laughed out loud actually when you said, should we be looking at this for adults too? Look, based on the number of crazy things early in the pandemic I bought from social media ads that I do not need, and I'm in the process of giving away, a couple of years later, yes to adults. Also, there are vulnerable populations like the elderly who are akin to, to children in some regards, but I think all adults for sure. So I think you might have a couple of papers here, and I would suggest that maybe one of them, you'd want to pick up a co-author. You've gotten a lot of terrific ideas about, well, what kind of law could we pass, et cetera. So maybe there's a co-author in the audience, I don't know. But, I do think that if you want it to be, you could use this as a platform to go in multiple directions. And it's not, you don't have to stuff everything just into this one paper if you don't want to. So my last piece of feedback was actually provided by my cat, Tatters, Kitty Gluck. I was reading. Is this what you were waiting for? So while I'm reading the paper, I've got the pages I haven't read yet next to me and the pages I've already read. And I go to get the next page and the paw is on the page and it was pointing to section 6. What future research is necessary to create evidence-based policy? Isn't that a question that a lot more papers should ask and discuss? I think so. And so does Tatters. So a little bit of advice from my cat. Thank you for an awesome paper.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you so much, Tatters.
I'll let her know.
On
She
the-
might be watching. I don't know.
On the kid thing, we obviously think this doesn't just apply to kids. The reason we're focusing on kids is first of all, because Daniela's research specifically looked at middle schoolers and they are in that perfect space that, advertising policy tries to draw a line at the kids after the age of so-and-so understand that something is an ad and therefore they don't need protection anymore. But also, talking to, it's Daniel, right? Daniel, it just seems like the kid issue is something that right now a lot of people from both political parties can really get behind and care about. And so it just seems like the best use case to really push this idea that, we need to expand on fairness or whatever we end up arguing. So that's, but yeah, we think it's more than kids.
It's always been the case. I've seen so much terrible legislation aimed at children's issues and everybody gets behind it, even though the ideas are, the implementation makes no sense because it's about children. That's like mom and apple pie. So for sure, an area to explore. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hey, Charles Simon, 3L at UW Law, and I spoke way too close to the microphone earlier. I really loved the paper. It was wonderful. There have been many amazing comments, and I'm sure there are many more behind me, so I'll be brief. I thought your anecdote about the ABO robot dogs was phenomenal. And as a history major prior to law, I'm really attracted to these kinds of sort of anecdotes that reveal something because, among other things, they draw me in as a non-tech person and they give a very interesting human element. And for those who may not have noticed this part in the paper yet, the anecdote is about when Sony discontinued ABO in 2018. And there were so many Japanese families for whom the ABO dogs had become part of the family. And it created a secondhand organ market for ABO dogs so they could keep repairing them after Sony would no longer repair them. And then ABO dogs have been receiving Buddhist funerals when they finally break down and can no longer be fixed, which is fascinating on its own right. But what's even I guess, materially interesting following that is that the new ABO model costs $300 a month for cloud services for its computing and memory storage.
I think it's a year, 300 a year.
300 a year?
But still,
That's still a lot.
and you can imagine them setting the price
Yes. they're
Are
like
they
six-
setting the price
60 a month?
according
60 a
to-
month is a lot.
Yeah.
So what strikes me especially, and you touch on in the following paragraph, and as Sue mentioned, this is basically an entire other paper that's hidden inside your paper, is you're paying Sony to keep your personal information in the cloud so they can sell it to other people. It's an incredible opt-in to the surveillance capitalism like model where they're extracting from you two ways, monetarily and by your data. It's just an incredible concept. So I really have nothing further to add as someone who took a privacy class. That's very fascinating and horrifying to me, but that's easily another 30-page paper, of course. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful paper.
Thank you. I didn't even think of that, but yes, like the people who pay to wear like a t-shirt that says Nike on it. It's like, you're getting screwed over twice.
Hi, I'm Emily. I think I'd like to be known as the organizer of the 2015 Seattle We Robot. So what I'm about to say doesn't come from my corporate affiliation, but from love of this kind of research. You both know Toys That Listen was something I worked on for several years. It included research that continued with Jason Yip, and I know you already know that name, but for those who don't, who are interested in child research, highly recommend his design lab and all of those research papers. I think one thing that would help the paper, as you've already gotten lots of recommendations about transparency and why transparency is important and going beyond the FTC and all of those things, thinking about some of the disclosures that don't work. I think one of the things that makes a really good impression that's in everybody's paper, but is not yet in yours, is Lori Craner and all of that work about how many hours it takes to read those disclosures. So if we know adults can't do it, then how are children supposed to? And I think that's a theme in some of your anecdotes as it runs through. So hopefully that is a helpful pointer. Another pointer that I think would be useful, there's a paper that came out of UW as well, but it's called Data Statements. And there is the well-known movement around documenting data, ML, and AI. I think model cards is one of the most famous examples. But the thing I love about Data Statements from Emily Bender and Batya Friedman is about how you identify where research is coming from. And so what you set as the normal baseline. And so in your paper, there's a couple places where you talk about different research studies on kids. And I think it could be helpful to say this one's in Italy, this one's in this country. But I think if we did a study in any country, you'd find that 40% of children don't wash their hands. So it might be helpful to think about the context. There's a real movement, at least in NLP, and Emily Bender is one of the people I know leading the charge to make sure that if we're saying something is happening in one country, then we're saying, hey, it's happening in this country. And just being aware of how we identify countries and when we do and why we do it. So I love that you brought in children's research from around the world. I think it's really important. And I think children are a way of getting regulation to move. And hopefully in speaking to regulators, they'll do it in a good way instead of necessarily COPPA, which has had some interesting implications. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you so much for pointing out that anecdote about, I think you're talking specifically, we mentioned a study that was done in India about hand washing. And I think that's really important. When I think back on that anecdote, I think, and the other anecdotes that are around it, I wanted to highlight the idea that researchers are perceiving vulnerable populations and trying to persuade them to do something. And I think that's why, like, originally I had thought about putting in this perceived population in India that needed to wash their hands more, and they were trying to persuade them. I think that could come across a lot better in the paper and be more disclosed about the intention of the research behind it, or the perceived intention. So thank you for that comment.
Thank you for the paper. It's really was a fascinating paper, and I learned a lot from it. Just a side point that I think maybe is applicable to a lot of people in this room. If you don't know Blake Lemoine, you might want to think carefully about using him, because media accounts are not necessarily accurate as to his personal circumstances. And if you're going to talk about Blake Lemoine, I think it's important to represent what he actually says accurately, which the paper does not do.
Really?
So you are not accurately representing his views. So it's in the public record, so you can find it. But I think a better course of action is just not to use Blake Lemoine. This is a person who if you knew more about him, you might not want to use him in this sort of public way. The substantive comments are about deception versus manipulation. And so, going back to 1957 in Vance Packard's The Hidden Persuaders, right? It's sort of well known that advertising and marketing is manipulative. That's sort of what it is. That's what it does. So you think about Cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, right? So here we have an anthropomorphic cartoon character, and these characters affect us in all kinds of ways. That's manipulation, but it's not necessarily deception. It's not like if at the end of the Cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs cartoon, they said, this is a cartoon and this is not a real creature, that would change anything, right? So I think it's very important to understand sort of the moral differences between and policy differences between deception and manipulation. We treat deception differently than we treat manipulation in the law, and we treat it differently in our moral lives, right? So I know that this adds a complication to the paper, but if this is really a paper about manipulation and not about deception, then I think that has important policy implications. I'd just say one more thing, which is this is manipulation in a new context, right? So there's manipulation all over. All advertising is manipulation. But then it comes across in a new context, and that might lead us to think, oh, we've got to stop this without considering whether or not in the new context is really morally relevantly different than the old contexts, right? So it might turn out that if we apply the same reasoning to other contexts, what we're going to do, if we're just talking about children, the consequence is no advertising of any kind directed at children, because it's all manipulative, right? So I think it's important to pause at that point and think seriously about the question whether our reaction is sort of inconsistent, that we're looking at the novel context and not applying the same sort of policy standards or moral standards that we're applying in other contexts. Anyway, it was a marvelous paper. I learned so much from it. Thank you.
Thank you. And so I'm not completely familiar with all of the existing literature on like deception versus manipulation, but my initial thought is that we already are being incredibly inconsistent when we do things like ban subliminal advertising, but allow for other forms of advertising. And to me, I've always wondered if it just boils down to the illusion of control. If we as a society believe, or as individuals believe that, we're not personally manipulated by, the button on a website being easy to click or something, but we're scared of subliminal advertising, I don't know that there's actually a difference in how it affects our behavior, but we think that there is. We think we have more control over one than the other. And so anyway, that is a lot of food for thought, and I would love to delve more into that. And also just a note on Blake, because I've actually been in conversation with Google a lot about virtual agents in the aftermath of that. And I don't know if this addresses your point. I would love to, I'm going to look up the inconsistencies that you mentioned, but my position on it, which maybe is not represented by the introduction, is that the press, the way that he is portrayed in the tech press in the aftermath was as someone who's like very naive and kind of an idiot. And I mean, I think that we're all Blake. The research shows very clearly that this isn't just a naive person, but that we all fall prey to this, or like we all tend to do this with artificial agents. And so I think we need to be careful about just dismissing him as like a particularly naive or vulnerable person. And I also, like I mentioned earlier, think that this goes way beyond kids. So I do think we have to take that incident very seriously. But yeah, I'd love to talk more about, you seem to know more about him than I do, so.
So I think we're gonna extend the time a little bit.
Right,
'cause
I
we
was just gonna
started.
ask, right,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So I think we should give it at least 5 more minutes. We have a little bit of leeway because of the nature of the next session and the fact that there's a break. Also I want to not feel selfish in making comments I'm about to make. So I think we're gonna extend it a little bit of time, but maybe what we could do is not respond much more. Yeah. I'm sorry if I
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I was. gonna
okay,
say.
all right, good. We're usually on the same page. So Ryan Cayley, University of Washington. So a couple of things. So I think for the sake of time, I want to focus on this question of whether it's possible to remedy or if there's an intervention, you could do it as a design matter, right? So what the literature suggests, and Daniela's own work shows this too, is that anthropomorphic effects do last over time. And so, for example, Melissa Bateson et al. 2006, cues of being watched when you put eyes in front of the, coffee on the honor system collection basket, you get the same effect at week 2 as you do at week 9, right? So in that sense, these visceral notices are sticky, and but at the same time, we know that even if you're talking to a person, and in fact you are, there are ways in which interpersonal dynamics defeat notice. And one example of that you might want to look at is when doctors reveal to you that they are sponsored or have gotten money from or whatever from pharmaceutical companies, that actually causes trust in the doctor to go up, because hey, weren't they frank with me? You know what I mean? And so that's a really interesting brutalizing effect there, and might be useful here, because it's not about the stickiness per se, it's about the fact that when you're dealing with people, the dynamics are different and these things pose like people. The other example I would give you is if you're approaching the Federal Trade Commission and you're trying to convince them, hey, you should really be looking at evidence, based rulemaking here. An example is the Federal Communications Commission's rules about whether or not you can advertise using the character from the television show that the ad is being played. And so there's a rule that says you can't use Dora to sell Ford Explorers during Dora the Explorer. You know what I mean? And no amount of disclosure was enough for the Federal Communications Commission, because the basic insight was children cannot tell when they're in entertainment land versus you're selling them land. You know what I mean? And so there have been examples outside of the FTC context in which this kind of this very sort of research has actually led to rulemaking, and that might strengthen your case. Last thing, and this is totally superficial, but I feel like depending on who your audience is, you're going to want to maybe shy away from like Harris quotes, like from the social dilemma, in favor of like the people who originally said these important things better in more complex ways. So the Langdon Winners or the Bruno Latours, much more so than Tristan Harris's. But I love the paper and hope that was short enough. And let's extend the conversation.
Yeah. Thanks, Justin. I'm an attorney and I'm not speaking for my employer. Quick comment. As I was reading your paper, which again, like everyone says, fabulous. I started to think, wow, what is there a lot of research on children and adults, but more so for the children, since that's your focus in their interactions with puppets. And I know that is the least sexy thing to say, but we have a long history of interacting as people with these sort of obviously transparently not human and controlled by humans, speaking, talking, persuasive items, right? And so I'm just thinking of like all this, like probably there's like
a wealth of documentation with respect, particularly to children and their interactions and belief of what puppets say and beliefs and interactions, right? And there's also that, you know, the joke about the adult that like, you know, tries to strangle the puppet because it said something they don't like, right? Like that's just seems to me like one stepping stone that may help bolster an argument that obviously is cogent and persuasive, but also like may really land, may give you a little bit more ammunition. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm an attorney and I'm also not speaking on behalf of my employer as well. It's a fantastic paper. I really appreciated and enjoyed reading all aspects to it. A lot of what I had to say, Woody already covered. I think leaning into the manipulation and the unfairness doctrine as a way of understanding this and sort of maybe even understanding the history of it, that it was a resurgent tool that was used beginning in the early 70s to be very aggressive in going after things, including going after advertisements to children and attempting to end all advertisements to children, which led to the backlash, which ultimately crushed unfairness as a substantive doctrine that was used. And sort of understanding that background and where you're coming into might be very helpful as you're trying to persuade and talk to the FTC, but also recognizing the political moment that we're in, where we have a resurgent FTC who may be interested in these things, and then using the fantastic research to sort of identify that this is a particularly problematic use case that probably does extend beyond where prior concerns were. The other thing that I sort of wanted to sort of raise here is that part of these conversations about resurgent unfairness doctrine at the FTC and around the country involves the sort of merchant of death issues. So there's firearms advertising was part of the Bushmaster v. Soto Connecticut Supreme Court case, relied on a cigarette rule understanding of the UDAP statute in Connecticut. There's been calls to do that at the FTC as well, which obviously probably won't revive the cigarette rule, but it's being proposed. And then there's a lot of issues with child advertisement with vaping and the rise of vaping and the sort of like tremendous problems we've seen with increased teen vaping and things like that. So I think that those are potential areas to look at, not just for the paper, but also maybe for the research side as well. So.
Thank you.
Hi, Cindy Grimm, Oregon State. If you haven't heard of it already, there's this great short story called I Always Do What Teddy Says by Harry Harrison, which is definitely a good read in this space. It's a very old story, but because there isn't enough in your paper, one of the things that struck me is there's this notion, just starting to do research on this, and this is sort of to Sue's point, is that when I went to the UK, instead of having just the calorie information on the side, they now have this little thing on the front that's like red, yellow, green, depending on how bad it is for you, right? In each of these different categories, right? And I almost feel like that's probably more effective. And so I feel like there's sort of a missing part of this space, which is clearly kids are not, this disclosure thing doesn't work. The transparency thing doesn't work. What's sticky? Like what can help people? Like you need to do the research. You need to actually actively prove that the thing that you are putting in front of the kid or the parent or whatnot actually helps them to understand where that thing is in terms of the safety risk. So it's just sort of a thought that like, I would like to see more research on what does work rather than sort of just Xing out everything that doesn't work. And maybe you should just put all children's robots in the sewer because then they wouldn't be able to advertise to you.
We do want to, we propose at the end, like more exactly that research. So we agree.
Hi, I'm Andrew Hunt, and mine actually kind of relates to what she was saying. This looks like a really interesting paper. I've only skimmed a couple paragraphs, and I'm hoping to read more. But I ended up thinking about a topic that might be a relevant scope worth considering, like as an on-the-ground issue that's sort of active now relating to children with disability. And that I'm still learning about myself, and I mentioned this to Daniela offline the other day. And so many autistic people tend not to make eye contact in a manner that's expected by neurotypical people. And the autistic-run nonprofit Autistic Self-Advocacy Network indicates that for many autistic people, meeting those expectations for eye contact requires tolerating like intense piercing discomfort which doesn't diminish with time. And so they seek to sort of focus training on useful skills rather than meeting normative social expectations. And so this could indicate that some of the autism focused robots that are run on children today that sort of aim to increase eye contact are problematic now. And that might be a valuable space for assessment of examples like that, and sort of the manipulation of children, self-determination, regulation, and policy. Yeah. Guess it's a comment, not a question, but sorry.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kirsten Herring from the University of Denver. And I really like the paper and the presentation because it's so inspiring of what is about to come with social robots. It made me think about all the responsibility we right now put on the user. And I know how persuasive robots can be because I ran the studies where a robot made people do things they didn't want to do. And it surprised us because it was, well, how easy that was. Right. So my question, and this is going to sound like I'm completely missing the context of the legal context here, is like, what would be the incentive for robot designers and companies and like, right, to use the better technologies and ethical guidelines and like, right, to build a better robot product that might not use that might not put all the responsibility on the user or might not use marketing? Is there like an intrinsic incentive for companies to do that, right, and shy away from the current concept that we have on like how to market these things?
That's a great question.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And
Yeah, let's talk.
Thanks.
Hi, Kirsten Martin at the University of Notre Dame. What I liked about this, and this is to push back on the idea that all ads are manipulative, is that there's enough work around specifically manipulation to differentiate it from just mere persuasion, which is above board. So to differentiate subliminal messaging versus just outright advertising, that it's covert, it's relying on a vulnerability that you have. And so manipulation more recently is more like targeted to a person or to a group of people where you're leveraging their vulnerabilities. And so this is, I think, you can use that to say, this is not just advertising. This is actually manipulation is when we're using someone's vulnerabilities against them in a covert manner. And I think that also gets to the idea that it can be covert to a person. Like, I know your concerns, and so I'm going to manipulate you because I know specifically your concerns. But also, a lot of times businesses aren't allowed to do things to vulnerable populations, whether it's temporarily vulnerable, teenagers, children, elder. And so I think this combination of manipulation as the use of someone's vulnerabilities against them and children specifically to kind of tease that out in the area of robots is really powerful because we don't have to rely on it even being targeted to an individual. We can just say, look, when you're engaging with a vulnerable population like children, it's very easy to manipulate them, easier than adults. Now, we could later extrapolate that and say, hey, should we be doing this at all if we're all slightly vulnerable around robots in that way? So, but I think that it'd be easy to take manipulation more recently as the covert using of vulnerabilities against somebody and apply it to children. And then someone else mentioned bringing up elders as like a discussion item for later, because I like the idea of using this also as a comment for FTC since they have that call right now. But I do know that FTC is worried about fraud against elders. I remember talking to them about like fake voices, and they were very worried about the use of it against people who are older. And so I think that would, to the idea is that you could actually use that as well, like in the end, to say this also could be applied to certain groups that are older. And then the last thing is a friend of mine, Vic Bhargava, he does a piece on social media addiction. And what I like about it, and it might be useful for you, it's the use of someone's, he talks about the different economic models and like the use of your data against you and how it's demeaning, and it's a philosophical paper, but he also talks about it. It was also cited by one of the commissioners of the FTC. So if you're looking at the FTC, they would recognize it. But it's called like social media addiction. If you just Google that in Vikram, and if you don't see it, just email me and I'll give it to you. But he really talks about the damage of using your own information about you against you in a demeaning way, and also how the advertising model actually needs to be separated from the use of your data against you. But it'd just be a useful site, and it's great.
Thank you. We're also going to read all of your work before we speak about this ever again.
Well, yeah, and I just, It occurred to me that I want to give a +1 to Margot and Cindy and Bill's paper about averting robot eyes, specifically because of its focus on the FTC and Ryan's paper. And so it occurred to me that we have a lot of people that think about manipulation right here. It would be awesome to talk about comments for the FTC. So if people are interested in that, then let's get talking about that, because the people in this room have thought about it as much as anyone. Okay, I apologize. Go ahead.
I love that last comment about the dangers of exploiting people's vulnerabilities. And it struck me as a thought exercise. One of the vulnerabilities that anthropomorphized robots are exploiting is that people start relating to them less as advertisement, which brings in all the law of advertisement, and relate to them more like people. And I wonder, as a thought exercise, if there are any aspects of the legal rules that we impose on people's dealing with people that would actually be interesting to think about in the context of anthropomorphized robots, because there are people who are in positions of trust and confidence with other people who have special obligations. And these robots are specifically designed to put themselves in a position of trust and confidence and to work their way into people's psyches, not as a machine, but as an intelligence, as a social actor that people can relate to. And just as a thought exercise, I was thinking, well, are there issues of good faith and fair dealing or fiduciary duty or some of those legal concepts that would be interesting to play around with?
Excellent. I think that's all the time we have. Thank you all so much. Please join me in congratulating all.
Great. All right, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a 10-minute break. And then we had a canceled paper, and we have a really great discussion that we're going to substitute for that canceled paper at the last minute. So we'll come back in 10 minutes, and I'll tell you more about that. Okay, thanks everybody. So we have right now a real, I think a real important experiment in a sense. So what had happened here is, let's call it that. But in the sense of format, because it's not something that we typically do at the conference. But what has happened is that we had a paper that promised to be very interesting about the intersection of human-robot interaction research and identity, aspects of identity such as race. And we had a preeminent engineer, a scholar who's here with us, Christopher Dancy from Penn State, who is an engineering professor whose work foregrounds the prospect of anti-racist robot design and artificial intelligence system design. And so we were going to put Christopher in dialogue with this paper. And when it canceled, I just thought to myself, what a shame it would be not to have that conversation. And so I reached out across campus to my friend and colleague, Timothy Brown. And Dr. Brown is a professor in our School of Medicine, but he is a trained philosopher. He is a PhD in ethics and is among the nation's leading commentators on certain aspects of bioethics, such as prosthetics and deep brain stimulation, and is a big part of our technology and society work here at the university. And Tim was gracious enough to come here and lead us in a conversation. So I'm going to let Tim frame the conversation they're about to have, but I just ask everyone to listen and to keep and to get involved in the conversation as appropriate. And I just want to say thank you again. Thank you both for being willing to have this conversation with us. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Tim. Thank you.
Thanks for that amazing introduction. It's really good to be your colleague. And it's very strange to call myself your colleague for reasons I'll say in a moment. I wanted to say, first off, a few words, not to just frame the conversation, but also to give us a little bit of a format. I'm going to say a couple of words about our positionality, my positionality with relation to Chris's positionality, because I think it's important to this conversation. Chris joins us as an associate professor at Pennsylvania State University in the industrial and manufacturing engineering and computer science and engineering, where he runs the THIC lab. Yeah, that's thick with 2 C's. Love it. It's the best lab name ever. The Human in Cognition and Computation, I believe, is the acronym for that. And I think Chris's background and context and corpus of work stands in an interesting relation to my own. So I'll say a little bit more about that to add on to Ryan's comments here. So I am in the School of Medicine in the Bioethics and Humanities Department. I'm an assistant professor. I was hired last July. So I just started my position. I've got whiplash. And typically at conferences like these, I'm the only Black person in the room, right? And sometimes the only Black American in the room. We were talking about this earlier, right? And so there's an experience of being the only one. And it's difficult, but it's something you work through. And there's also an experience of being not the only one, even if it's just the one other person. So it's really good to have you here with me, right? But it's also important that I recognize my positionality related to, next to yours. We come from different fields. We're also different in rank. And that means I can be extremely selfish about how I spend my time with you, right? Because you have so much that you can, advice and wisdom you can pass to me, but also, yeah, we all have the privilege of being in the room with you so that you can share that wisdom with everyone. But also, we are 2 Black people who are going to be shooting the shit, essentially. And so you all get to be there with us. And so to jump into this, a little bit more in terms of like the format for this, we're going to talk for about 30 minutes. We're going to open it up for questions and comments. Keep them respectful, given the nature of the conversation. Thank you. And then we won't stand too much in your way of getting lunch, because I know that's where we are right now. So one of the papers that you wrote is on this concept of moving beyond race, bias, and representation in how we think about artificially intelligent systems. You give a model in this paper. I recommend all of you read it. You give a model of how artificially intelligent systems interact with environments and human beings. And there's a lot packed into the model that you give of the human beings and the environment. To speak on the environmental factors, like you're thinking about the sociocultural systems and the structures of anti-Blackness within those sociocultural systems. And your paper is in part motivating the looking at those anti-Black structures, the unearthing of those anti-Black structures, so that artificially intelligent systems don't play a harmful role within those, exacerbating systems of oppression. And also interacting with humans, humans have, cognitive systems, affective systems, and physiological systems, all of which are tied in with anti-Blackness in some ways. The body is oriented. There's George Yancey argues a lot that whiteness is like a skin that connects white people to one another, and that we have to pierce that skin and rip it away in order to make any headway of addressing anti-Black racism. And so these are high stakes, right? And one of the things that I really like about your work is how skeptical you are of this idea that we can just, work on the biases in AI, or that we can work on, making AI fair, right? Or accountable or transparent, or, the whole FAT or fact business or the approach to, you know, unearthing some of these oppressive factors within artificially intelligent systems. So that leads me to my first question here. So what does it really mean to move beyond bias, right? And what does it mean to move beyond representation, right? So more specifically, why isn't debiasing enough? Why isn't more representation just a good in itself?
First, thank you for that introduction. That was a very nice introduction. In general, I definitely recognize the positionality. I encourage you to be as selfish as possible. As somebody with tenure, you know, now you get to be selfish and I just get to take your selfishness and give you what I can.
Nice. Thank you.
So when I'm thinking about that, what I'm really thinking about is the way that anti-Blackness, you know, racial structures more generally, but anti-Blackness within that are foundational to really everything we do. I'm thinking about a US context, but it's not just the US context when we're thinking about that, right? It's different depending on context, and that goes back to things like transatlantic slavery and Middle Passage. But the reason why I think we can't just kind of slice it at biasing is because one thing debiasing doesn't do is guard against the ways that institutional policies and these general systems kind of morph around whatever thing we create, whatever artifact we create, right? And so whatever artifact we create, I'm thinking about Simon and engineering and the sciences of creating artifacts. So whatever artifact we create is kind of formed within this social cultural landscape. And so that means that, you know, we can try to debias things, but it doesn't change the fact that system itself might be used within institutions. And so we have to really question what other people have called for, right? Whether we should create systems in different cases and what it means to create systems given those institutions that exist. And I think the difficulty there is there are times when that doesn't mean an AI system isn't, you know, think about generally AI system in robotics. It doesn't mean it might not be beneficial, but the question becomes, if it's only beneficial to certain people, if it means the harming of certain people given these structures, what does that mean that we don't consider them human enough to really consider that important? Thinking about humanity and humanness, going back to what I referenced in that paper, Sylvia Winter, and thinking about who's considered human, who isn't, and partially to that question about citizenship as well, thinking about some other writers who, now the name is not coming back to me, but it does make it in the paper, the reference does. I'm thinking about how citizenship is also entwined in that, in US context, as well as European context, right? Thinking about borders there. So I guess my skepticism isn't that there's nothing to be done, but it's more so that maybe the ratio of harm reduction that you have with debiasing is not correct, right? There's not enough structural approaches that, and then the truth is, I think that's not a low-hanging fruit, especially given the historical context that we're in. And it's a very difficult road to take. And so I think you have to be willing to take the difficult road. You have to be willing to forego funding in different cases. We know certain, right, famous AI researchers who have been fired and have chosen to go the route of less funding for that reason, because they realize that issue. So it's not easy, and there's no problem with harm reduction, right? That is a part of it, but I think that's got to be us, maybe not small, but definitely a lesser part than what we have right now.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think lies beyond bias? So what's waiting for us on the other end? Like, what is the intervention instead?
So thank you for that very difficult question. How do we solve the problem? The whole problem.
All of it, right now.
I mean, so I think, you know, building towards it is really not only acknowledging communities and participating with them, but I think it's like really working with them to understand the ways that the system should be created. It's not, so, you know, I have an example of a project that I was going to work with a colleague where we were looking at life quality and well-being of youth in a certain community where they had certain racialized issues. And one of the issues we had with our funding is the funding wanted us to say, all right, we're going to take this existing smart system and apply it to them in some way. What we wanted to say was, no, we're gonna go see if they even need a smart system, but we need some pilot money to just go see what they need. And I think the problem we ended up having was we couldn't get over that hump of, we don't really know that we need a particular type of AI system, or even that they should have one. We want to know whether it would be useful, right? And so I think there's partially it's community involvement as always, right? There's always going to be a little bit of local, a lot of local influence there. But the other part is, you know, at the institutional level, recognizing historically the way these processes have worked, the way that policies have worked to shape and more, not only the way people work and organizations work, but the way artifacts are created. And that real acknowledgement of that means that we have to change the way the policy is made. So that means when we're, you know, having these policies, it has to be foundational to assume that it's going to be anti-Black in many ways because of the way the structures are, right? The organizations and the structures that we have in front of us now are racialized, some would argue, I would argue in certain ways, and that structure has to be taken down. And that structure also means that by default, things are that way.
Absolutely. So it sounds like you're calling for a dismantling of the systems that we find ourselves in and a reconfiguration of like what's left over once we've like done an inventory of all the parts of a new structure that allows us to do the work of like, you know, working against anti-Blackness. And that's so hard. That's such a difficult, it's easy. Yeah, easy, right?
That's my solution. Just dismantle all the structures. That's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. So whenever I have conversations about this in my space, my space, wow. I'm dating myself.
Insert old joke.
Yes. So whenever in my circles, that's Google Plus. Woo, woo. But whenever I think about this prospect of moving beyond like diversity, equity, inclusion talk, which in some ways can turn into, and usually does turn into, lip service.
And by the way, Ronaldo Walcott has a really nice paper on moving beyond diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, read that one for sure. There's instead of talking about DEI, we end up talking about anti-racism, anti-sexism, so on and so forth. But a few of my colleagues, like specifically Oliver Rollins in the American Ethnic Studies Department, we were talking about his book Conviction, and a few others. And I think I share the sentiment. We're worried that the idea that technologies themselves can be anti-racist is difficult, right? And so a lot of people are calling on technologies that work against anti-Blackness. But is it even possible? Or is anti-Blackness like just the thing that working against anti-Blackness just the thing that we do as people making the technologies, critiquing the technologies? Is it something that the technologies can take on themselves, or can we leave that to the technologies to do?
Yes. So I guess one way maybe is a bit of reconfiguration of thinking about the systems, right? If we're thinking about them socio-technical systems, then we're considering how they're connected to us as people, communities, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
And I think with that reconfiguration, it gets easier to see how they can be used in that way to reconfigure to battle anti-Blackness, right? Because people do that, communities do that in different ways. But if we view the technology as in itself just the engineered artifact beyond the people who create it, beyond the people who use it, then it does get more difficult, I think, to imagine, because you just think, well, it's just going to be used in this context. But if we begin to imagine where the contexts in which they not only should, but are used, it gets a little easier maybe to think about the full configuration. But again, I think, as I thought about before, right, it gets more difficult because then you have to consider more things. It goes back even to like the human in the loop paper. We're really considering more things along the way, and that gets difficult to convince people that's important, right? Because we have a lot of individualism where the type of collaboration you need for that isn't valued in some places. It depends on where you are, what fields, et cetera. But that's the difficulty, I think, is you have to view it as a bigger system because it's a part of these structures. And there's a lot of complexity in that. And then, of course, within all that complexity, you also acknowledge that these systems exist, which is one of the other issues that we run into.
Absolutely. Well, let's shift gears a little bit here before we run out of time. Let's get your origin story. So how did you arrive at this kind of work? Like, what was the context for it?
So, it's really interesting, right? So some of you will be trained in engineering and computer science, and you would know, most likely, at least, I assume most people will have this experience where you're really discouraged in implicit, sometimes explicit, but very, very much so implicit organizational ways to look at any type of social consideration at all. Initially, it's better, it's a lot better now than it in a lot of places than it was even when I was an undergrad. But I certainly didn't start out thinking about these things within computer science. It's because I was discouraged. Personally, it's very natural for me. I'm from work, I guess I call it working class, whatever categorization, way people categorize that. Working class, single parent, family in prison. And so those things color the way I view the world and in my own context. And it means that, when other people might get to say, well, I'm going to think about this thing, think about race or turn it off or when somebody might say, well, I have to think about this now. My answer and a lot of people's answers, you would know this is, I'm always thinking about that, right? That's just what color, that's the water that I live in. And so for me, that's the water I live in, but I'd never really gotten a chance to really apply it. So it wasn't really until I was a faculty member that I had a chance to really read stuff. And so I think the one travesty of not having a chance to interact with some of this stuff in undergrad and grad school is it was always there, but I could never make sense of it. And I could never connect it to the systems. And that it's one of those things that it's there, but you can't put words on it. You can't explain it. So it's hard to really describe it as a system level phenomena in engineering systems. And so, the typical way this happens, right? Mowing and listening to audiobooks. That's how it started.
Nice.
That actually is how it started, just listening to stuff, reading stuff, writing stuff, eventually taking the leap of faith and starting trying to collaborate with a colleague in critical Black studies, which was a lot, right? It's very humbling to be somebody in a different area, especially there where, they've read like every book. Yeah, you're in computer science, where you almost went to computer science, so you didn't have to read the same way or write the same way. And now here I am. So that was very useful, right? To have Khalil, who's on that paper, help me out with different things, right? In certain ways that changed the way I thought about things. And then just, be there to kind of bounce ideas off at different times, just talk. And really, I think it's even good just have him there because it's almost like having, he's not an advisor, but this is somebody else who, when you write it, you want it to be right. Right. Even like the draft one, something like here, right? You want it to be correct and you want, and that I knew he was going to be constructive. So for me, that's kind of the journey that led to it, though. Like I said, even though I didn't start until the faculty, the context was always there. It was always primed. It was just kind of something that I had to keep down out of necessity because of my education.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I feel it's only fair to share some of my own origin story. I can identify the moment that I switched my research focus. I was at a conference, a neuroethics conference, and there was an entire panel on criminalization and figuring out biomarkers for criminal behavior. And I was there thinking, well, are they talking about, testing for criminality? Given the demographics of US prisons, are they talking about it in an international context? And no, they were talking about it in a US context. So that to me meant they were thinking about testing and intervening on Black people and Latinos, right? Most specifically. And as a graduate student at the time, it took all of my confidence to get up there and hold a mic in a shaky way and ask, what about Black people, right? And then the answer was, we control for that in our studies. And it was the most, and then, at that point, I just decided to write a paper, and it was really frustrating. But like, as a philosopher, I did have the luxury of reading. Like I did have the luxury of reading, but I didn't want to get pigeonholed as a Black philosopher and have to do Black work all the time. But there are just like little moments like that that make me remember why I got into this field or the subfield at least, and remind me why I keep going. So how do you feel like you were empowered to do this kind of work? I know that you say that like being in a faculty position gave you the space to do it, but did you run into any pushback within your department or within the field in general? I'm sure that the answer to that is certainly yes, but what kinds of pushback did you get?
So one thing, I thought your point of being pigeonholed was really interesting because that's actually something that came into my mind. I did have interest in some ways, even in grad school, but frankly, you can't become the Black computer scientist or cognitive scientist who just studies that, because then that's just who you are. You can't be seen as anything else, right? And that's the risk. Until you're comfortable at least with taking up the problems. And now, of course, we're fortunate in some ways that it's not as taboo as it would have been at different times, right? There's a certain power in that. But for me, I think I was fortunate that my department, at least the people who I listened to, didn't have any issues, at least with what I was doing. Right, that part was just nice, right? Not having to worry about that. The other thing was, I was pretty confident I could get tenure, and I could like spin up a paper or two if I really needed to get the numbers down. So to be honest, I started switching my area, 6 or 7 years ago, or started the plan and started writing, knowing that if I got like a review back that was not as good, I could change it if I really need to. Right? I could spin stuff up with what I do, because my other area in cognitive science was, I was pretty confident in that. I think, to be honest, it was almost hard to kind of leave that behind a little bit, because I think there's a lot of work to be done there. I just think that this area, this focus is a little more important. It's still there. It's just the things I'm working on are so complex now that it would be hard to do both at the same time, unless I have the right grad students.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, that reminds me, I'm recruiting 4 grad students for next year. Two for human AI, particularly in human AI interaction, 2 more for anti-Blackness and AI design, broadly construed. So if you have undergrads or anybody who's interested in PhD in industrial engineering or computer science, particularly, let me know, or have them send me a message or email or something.
Got any postdocs?
See, now you put me on the spot. I don't have any postdocs right now.
No,
I mean, I need postdoc funding though.
We'll work on that. Yeah.
I'll take them if I have the funding. So yeah, I figured I put that in there because it's really hard to recruit grad students in this.
Oh yeah.
In this area. But so yeah, I didn't really have too much pushback. But I had a certain confidence, and I was fortunate in that and having that confidence and where I was at. And I also, so the other secret is the place I was at before I was at Penn State did not really care about funding that much. And so that means I didn't have to tailor the work I did to funding. And before, I mean, really, if we're being honest, right, before the rebellions of 2020, the funding for anything like this would be pretty much shot down pretty fast, right? Blackness is a little bit more acceptable as something to put in to the things you're doing now, but it wasn't that way. And we'll see if that lasts, to be frank.
Yeah.
And see how that trails off. So I was, because I didn't have to go after funding, that meant that I could really explore the space in different ways, and I could think about it differently. Rather than what's going to get me the grant, I could think, what do I want to do? What impact do I want? Where do I think the issue is? Which is a different question, right? And if we're thinking about the pragmatics of academia, particularly in engineering, in computer science, where you can be required to get like lots of funding. So yeah, that's kind of.
I think this speaks to a broader issue where, transdisciplinarity is often discouraged because it's difficult to get funding. So anytime you take it as an engineer, take a step toward the humanities, you're thought to be taking a step away from engineering, but our technologies are created and are given uptake within a social context. So the technologies are never divorced from this context, as everybody at this conference knows. But also, yeah, right now, I mean, at least, yeah, before 2020, I think it was even worse than you're saying. It's like, oh, when it gets shot down, well, Donald Trump wrote an executive order saying that, medical research couldn't even use words like social justice, right? So I was worried going on to the job market that I wouldn't even be able to do the research I wanted in the medical space. So really crappy situation there. But yeah, thinking about like, yes, dismantling these systems that keep us from doing this kind of research. And I'm so glad you were able to, circumnavigate that. So we've talked we've said a few words at this point about, dismantling systems and unearthing systems. These systems are like everywhere. We're saturated with systems of oppression, right? So they're part of our theories of knowledge. They're part of academia itself. They're part of our laws and policies within different contexts. And it feels impossible. It feels like a heavy lift, right? Like we were joking earlier, like, let's just solve it right now. Let's do it. It feels too big. It feels like outside of the scope of one person. And so conversations of this type with researchers who are just trying to run a lab feel like, a step away from doing the actual work of engineering or whatever, the actual work. And not only that, like you said earlier, these are the things that we breathe, like anti-Blackness is in the air, it's in the water. And in some ways, I think it's buried in the ground. It's so hard to see. We have to excavate it, right? We have to excavate it in a way where we can expose other people to it, like make them see what we see, what we live, honestly. But how do we take on work of that scale, right? And how do we convince other people to take that work up with us? Deep questions.
Yeah, easy question. So the scale thing is, to me, things like levels of analysis become really useful, thinking about individual, organizational, institutional. Breaking it up in those ways are useful because we have these natural structures like organizations, the individual cognitive neuro individuals, institutions and policies, right? So I think it's natural to break it up in those ways, and even all those levels aren't fully explored as racial structures. So it's useful to do that and think about the ways they connect. So if you're tackling that, I think thinking about it as an engineer, right, systems and levels of analysis becomes really useful to make it clear kind of what you're attacking in this theory or this process that you're developing or artifact that you're developing in general. In terms of convincing other people, if I had that answer, I mean, maybe I'd have a lot of money. I don't know. That's a difficult one, right? It's a slow process to convince other people. Some of it, I guess, you hope you kind of follow as Tressie McMillan Cotton has talked about the idea of educational gospel, right? We're in academia. So we have we believe that it'll be good, it'll make people better. And so I guess there's part of that. The education part of it is really important. And we're facing a battle with that, right? With education being used in those ways. But I think it starts with really conversations and narratives and being able to construct those narratives, understanding history. And I think those things are what makes it so difficult, right? Is because we don't even have the correct history that's taught to understand these things exist. That people are like, I never knew that was a thing, right? You look at Du Bois Black Reconstruction. I never knew that's the way that Reconstruction actually worked. And so I think that's a difficulty in education is an important part because that's where the cultural knowledge is imparted on people, right? So that's a start, but in the end, it's just a slow process of narrative and convincing, I think. Now, that's not really a good answer, I think, because I don't think there's a good one-shot answer. It's just a slow process. And it's a process that's taken hundreds of years. So why would it be a quick fix, right?
I think that's actually like really helpful to think, okay, this is just the next phase of something that's been brewing for a long time. To not think that you're in it alone, to not think that this is something that you have to take on your own. and to recognize and read the histories of the discourses that you're engaging in. Even if you weren't aware of those discourses before. I think that's really important.
Well, I think it's not to say that anybody can read everything, right?
Oh, of
There's
course not.
plenty, right?
Yeah.
There's plenty that I don't know. There's plenty that you won't know, despite
course.
all of the reading, the well-readness of it.
Yeah.
But I think if you, as long as you come in with a bit of humility and understand that you have that missing piece and are willing to acknowledge that, it helps.
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot of discourse about this concept of epistemic humility. So we learned yesterday, epistemic has to do with knowledge, right? Good. And so there's or knowledge and being a knower or being positioned with regard to a system of knowledge. And so being epistemically humble means being humble with regard to that positionality, knowing that there are things that you don't know and things that you might not be able to know ever. And that it's always okay to ask questions and make relationships where that knowledge can be shared. And so, yeah, epistemic, this is what I'm hearing and what you're saying. Being epistemically humble can really be good for your mental health, right? Like not putting that expectation on yourself, but not, excusing yourself from having to read anything at all. So I think, yeah, that's really good advice. I was going to ask you for advice, but this is great. But yeah, to close out this discussion a little bit, because we're getting close to the time, what advice would you give? What lessons, what message would you want people in this room to take away from this conversation? I understand this is like a really brief introduction to your work on anti-Blackness, and you have a lot more work to do. We both have a lot more work to do. But what do you want people to take back to their labs, their companies, their research groups?
I guess the biggest thing for me is to recognize that racial structures, in general, anti-Blackness, and particularly in the US context, is foundational to everything we do. And so that means it can't be a side consideration. It has to be part of the foundation consideration. And that means that in the end, you have to make certain sacrifices for that acknowledgement. But I think the important part there is it's not a side part. And that's one of the issues with a lot of DEI discourse. It's not a side part, that it is, right? It is the water that we live in. And so I think for me, anything that you engineer or any process that you're worrying about, that always has to be part of the context that you're considering. Because it is for some other people.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, like we don't have engineering unless we have whiteness. I feel that deep inside. And so it's important to remember that it's not just, like one subspecies of, this field of critical race studies or something like this. And that's not to say that, thinking about anti-Indigenous perspective, I mean, anti-indigeneity or anti-Asian hatred or, queer phobia or sexism, right? Aren't features of the world, but there's a sense in which anti-Blackness is central to the ways that we construct artifacts, the ways that we create systems. And this is just a fact of history. The African diaspora, we have colonization, the piecing apart of Africa, and the exportation of human lives into every part of this world.
Well, and the exploitation of property, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And so, yeah, I think, anti-Blackness is at the core of it. But I think there's room at the center for all of our perspectives, right? Especially insofar as all of those perspectives overlap. But yeah, this is great advice. These are great thoughts. So yeah, we'll stop it here and let's take some questions.
Hi, I'm Andrew Shaw. I'm an undergrad at the University of Washington, intern at the Tech Policy Lab. First, thank you both for this illuminating conversation. Chris, I really loved your question at the beginning of who is considered human and your reference to Sylvia Wynter's work. And my mind goes here to Alexander Wahelier, who extends Wynter's work and writes about personhood and the law. So that got me wondering, in conjunction with this discussion about anti-racist technologies, if we can leverage personhood in the law as a tool here to combat anti-Black technologies. So in particular, I'm thinking about proposals to kind of place liability on AI systems and sort of give them personhood and also those duties associated with personhood, the ability to be sued. So I just wanted to get your reaction to that, if there might be a way to leverage this language of humanism against anti-Black structures and technologies.
I think I definitely agree there has to be a way to tackle the issue of those systems. I wonder whether, I mean, there's two things that I wonder potentially problematic with that. One is, of course, that offsets some of, it potentially can offset some of the obligation for the people in the process of the artifact. And I think the question always is then, if you can treat the artifact in that way, you know, who's kind of responsible for it and when you're doing that. The other issue I always am worried about when thinking about AI systems is how humanhood or personhood then is tied into who is and who isn't considered human, how artificial systems are, you know, required in order to have an artificial system, artificial intelligence system, AI system, robotics, you have to kind of ascribe intelligence in certain ways. And that also has very odd interactions with anti-Blackness and Blackness. And so I think there's a possibility for that, and the policy people would know much more on the, you know, the history and ways, you know, I still love the steamboat example from yesterday, on ways that we can kind of treat who is and who isn't responsible. But I do think you have to be careful, right? And make sure that as you do that, you're not still not acknowledging the racial structures that are in place that cause the harm. So I think it's possible, right? It's a tool, but I think it's probably a little more harm reduction than full-on change structure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add on a little bit. There's this huge discourse on what they call epistemic violence, and as a subspecies of epistemic injustice. I think in philosophy, if you put epistemic on anything, it's a hot topic. But this is Christy Dotson's work at MSU, where she argues that when we get dismissed as knowers, when Black people get dismissed as knowers, we're doing violence against them, right? And especially when it comes to dismissing the testimony that's supposed to get uptake in certain ways. We don't think that they're competent enough, then and then we dismiss them. Their lack of uptake could get them literally killed in encounters with the police, in courtroom encounters. And when I think about the possibility of conferring personhood onto artifacts, I think about how could the personhood of the artifact and the epistemic weight of the artifact supplant or replace or erase the epistemic personhood, I mean, the personhood of Black people, right? And so, yeah, I worry about that. Yeah, there are some weird interactions. I think that's right. But yeah, that's just my thoughts, random thoughts.
Hi, thank you.
Hi.
Thanks so much for this great conversation. I'm Kristen Thomason from University of British Columbia up north in Canada. The Canadian perspective plays into my first question. I have two questions, but feel free to take either or neither or whatever. Tim, you touched on this at the end of the conversation, and I'm just curious, either of you, Chris or Tim, of your thoughts on how colonialism weaves into what you've been talking about. Part of the reason I ask that is I really see with AI systems, and maybe this is like my lens coming onto this, a lot of colonial culture in the idea of like, we get to take information, hierarchy, categorization. So the way that AI, to my understanding, is structured, like there's a lot of analogy to colonial thinking. And so I'm just curious your thoughts on how colonialism interweaves with the anti-Blackness work that you've been doing. or the work on anti-Blackness that you've been doing. And then my second question, if I can indulge myself in having to, is I really struggle with the tension that you emphasized between harm reduction versus, you didn't use this wording, but like burn it all down. And so
I would never say that.
I'll say it. And I'm just curious because like the way that I struggle with it, and maybe this is echoed in your work, and I'd really love to just hear your thoughts, is like harm reduction feels much more practical, but then is harm reduction enabling a resistance against the, lack of a better term, burn it all down sort of approach, like a real disassembly and reassembly of structures. Anyways, those are two huge questions. I'd love to hear any thoughts you have.
So I'll do burn it all down, you do colonialism, and we'll see how it falls. No, the reason I wanted to start with the burn it all down, I can hear Mariam Kaba in that, right? And in her conflict with that as well, in discussion of how do you guard against the processes that seem like they're harm reduction, but really take us farther away from the systematic changes that we actually need. Burn it all down, or whatever that might look like. So I mean, I guess I don't have much comment besides maybe Mariam Kaba is very useful for people if you don't know her, as somebody to read, because she talks about this as well, this tension, right? I don't know a good answer for it, but I think, me personally, I think that is one of the issues with debiasing. I talk about this actually in the AI Blackness paper, right? One of the issues is with that ethics washing is you lose the archive. And by losing the archive, you lose the opportunity to see the ways that AI systems have affected people. And by doing that, then you no longer can say, all right, well, people have been affected by Google, for example, in this way. And so now you can't say, all right, well, this is how social cultural knowledge has changed due to systems like Google, given that we know that people use search engines and systems like that in a way that's like family memory and knowledge, right? And so I think we have to be very careful with the ways that harm reduction might affect the long-term ability to make certain arguments and combat things. And it's a difficult thing, right? Because you want to not have like these really bad, using search engines, not have these really bad results, but you also, you want to, while getting rid of those, you also want to keep that archive in some way. And I mean, that's an answer for the archivist. Maybe, I don't know, is Anne in here? If Anne was here, she might be able to answer, right? There's a lot more work in archive, but there are people who are worrying about the archive and certainly deal with that as well, that issue. Anyway, so I'll let you go with colonialism, because your words are like, I need to just have you beside me be like my translator.
Oh, what, like Obama's anger
Yeah,
translator?
you're like the opposite though. You're much more smooth.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but no, I really like this I like exploring this tension between harm reduction and revolution though. Just to say a tiny little bit about it before talking about your first question. I think that the tension here, I think we can alleviate it by thinking in terms of incremental steps toward revolution, right? Because like those harm reductions that put us in a position where we're locked. Yeah, we want to avoid those. I mean, that's just to say there are lots of distinctions between different kinds of harm reduction that we can find, and it's important that we do that. So that's all I want to say about that. But this, I think you're absolutely right that our attitude toward big data and feeding big data into algorithms and creating artificially intelligent systems is very colonial. And I think that we're seeing a lot more criticism of that aspect of data science and of artificial intelligence. So like many of you probably know that there's an alternative to the FAIR principles so like, I'm not gonna go through the acronym, but it's like findability, so on and so forth. And there's an alternative that was proposed by Indigenous communities in the United States and Canada, the CARE principles that emphasize governance over the data that is given. And this is especially a big deal in medical contexts where medical data has been used to medicalize the plight of indigenous communities. And also, you know, toward the ends of anti-Blackness at the same time for, in the same spatiotemporal world. And so I think, yeah, it is a very colonial space. And I think there are anti-colonial tactics. We can decolonize data science, but it's going to take like another hour to tell you how we might even bother. But I think things like the CARE principles are an important first step, and recognizing sovereignty, data sovereignty. If someone gives their data up and they represent a community like the Black community or Black communities, then they should have some sovereignty over their data, especially when those data could be used for anti-Blackness. So yeah, that's where I stand on it.
Awesome. Thank you both very much.
Thank you for the question.
And just I had 2 words written down, and I think this goes to your point, which is really you have to guard against accumulation and guard against capture, right? And those are the big things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
I'm going to move this because I think the only people who are following up for this are Lawrence and Ryan.
Nice.
Thank you so much for this extremely generative conversation. I really appreciate it. And also, I really appreciated that we're talking about colonialism and cultures of coloniality. And maybe we can also think about imperialism if we look at what these folks with these large, you know, owning these companies, you know, grabbing territory, whether that's social media territory or on Mars. But anyway, Mona Sloan, sociologist, University of Tübingen and NYU. I have a question to you both as educators. That's a question that I get sometimes and that I grapple with, which is how do you translate the tension that comes with these concepts of inequity, oppression, racism, anti-Blackness, with cultures of, you know, education and engineering, and how do you get your students to understand both, but also not frustrate them too much so they keep going and satisfy your chair and the school and all of that. Anything you can share on that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Oh yeah, I guess that would be me. So it's not easy. I think really it's dependent on the environment you're in, right? If we're honest, if you're in a department that won't value it at all to the point where they'll actually guard against it, there's not much you really can do, right? I mean, the biggest thing is really just finding your friends and maybe waiting it out a little bit. But the one thing you can do is, even if you don't explicitly announce it, there are ways to add in these considerations to any engineering process, right? Every engineering process that we have these things can be added to it. You just have to pick and choose what other topics you might need to modify or take out or reduce. And I think that tends to be the biggest tension, is realizing that you can't teach them everything. It's engineering education, right? Over the years, it's just basically packed everything into it. That's the reason why some places you're basically going for 5 years, if we're honest. Or if you finish in 4 years, you're actually doing really well. So you have to guard against that. Like that part itself is problematic, and be willing to accept that they're not going to learn maybe this or that equation. Maybe they get a little lesson, if you're teaching engineering analytics, a little less in forecasting. But because of that, they now have a perspective on systems that are much more powerful and understanding, and potentially a lot more impactful in a positive way. Or a negative way. So I think as you're doing it, if you hopefully you have friends and you can kind of start to put it into the curriculum as an educator, but even if not, there are ways to covertly do it and add to it. Students might complain, but you can't really. Students complain, so what are you gonna do, right?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, they do. I'm gonna add a little bit to that, because this covert, what do you call it? Like guerrilla education attitude. I think it came into my life a long time ago when I realized, even as a graduate student, even as a TA, I had control of the grades, so I could do whatever the hell I want. So I started doing things, and so, if I want to talk about, Christy Dotson that day, I get to. That's my discussion section. I get to do it. And in my faculty position, I just do what I want, because they're not going to question the rigor of it. It's my class. It's very rigorous. But I'm lucky enough to be in a department whose slogan is like better healthcare through social justice. So I don't have any problems there. But if I did, I wouldn't give a damn. But also, I think like even if you have that power to do the education work that you want to do, it's important to approach your students the right way. And I think one of the things that helped me get through this first year is, think about it in terms of like being vulnerable with your students, because everybody's got a story, everybody has expertise, and your students are going to have run into these issues. You're going to have students of color. Like, I don't have any Black students in my classes, but I have a lot of, like Southeast Asian students. I have a lot of Eastern European students. I have a lot of women in my courses. These are not distinct categories; they overlap. I just want to recognize that. But everybody's got stories and expertise and is vulnerable. So modeling being vulnerable about these issues, being personal, at least cautiously personal, can, open other people up to having these conversations and being sensitive to other people's needs in those conversations. So I think like that's one way of at least leading discussions. And of course, right, like above all else, don't put this stuff at the end of the course. Don't just have like a racial equity module. It has to be throughout the course, man. Or like make it the first module and keep referring back to it. Because the big pet peeve, I'm gonna move on. But yeah, that's what it is. But yeah, I think so. I think that's the advice I'd give.
I guess
Fabulous.
maybe we'll just let you like comment or
Yeah,
pose
that
questions.
sounds right.
Yeah.
And you keep letting people pass you, Kate.
No, they were all first.
Okay. Okay.
So Peter Acero, the new
Hey, Peter.
school. Hey.
Good to see you.
So I had the pleasure a few years ago of supervising a master's thesis that really asked this question about how do you make anti-racist technology. So you may be hearing from my student Evan O'Neill about a PhD, and so I kind of want to shift a little bit to this idea about away from these practical steps to the cultural and aesthetics, and thinking about how much the non-diverse sites of Silicon Valley and Seattle are projecting these imaginaries of the future. And that's what's driving the technologies and the applications that we're seeing. And what and how can we turn to, say, Afrofuturism or Black science fiction for new imaginaries that help us think about these anti-racist technologies?
Dude, this is an interview of Chris here. It's not are you like, okay, yeah.
No,
say
well, I
something.
was thinking about culture schemas. as you
Okay,
were saying
yes,
that,
say stuff, say stuff.
So yeah, no, I think you're right, right? As you're thinking about change in the way you have these more really racialized knowledge and the way you can kind of combat it, you have to acknowledge the different levels. And one of those is cultural schemas, and the way organizations perpetuate those cultural schemas along the way. So yes, but you got something you're excited about, it sounds like.
Okay, so I just edited a book, Philosophy of Black Panther. It's weird, weird thing to be on. I don't know. I accepted it when I was a grad student, and it took a long time to get out. But there's a piece in that I wrote where I start with Alicia. I think it's Aisha Wormsley's art piece, where it's just an innocuous billboard that says there are Black people in the future, and this billboard got taken down. It got reported by undoubtedly a Karen. Reading the story, yeah, it was a Karen. Of course it got, there was an appeal, it got put back up, but the complaint was that it was too political. And as far as I'm concerned, Blackness and Black bodies and our continued existence is always politicized, right? Like that's the category. It's a political category meant to accomplish certain aims. Ruha Benjamin would call it a technology. Race is a technology. And so I think that, yeah, this is an absolutely important question to consider. Like, how are representations shaping who we expect to be in the future and how we expect technologies to interact with them, or how we expect they are integrated with technology? And so far, like, our Afro and African futurist visions are very thin, right? I mean, I recommend all of you go read Nnedi Okorafor's whole collected works. She's great. But there are so many people to read and so many people to see who are putting together, art projects and movies and this and that. But in popular media, like especially like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, like outside of like Black Panther and like Shang-Chi and like maybe Miss Marvel now, they're doing better now, kind of, sort of. Outside of a few franchises, like, it's mostly like Iron Man flying around and, like, I guess we have the Falcon now. No, they're doing better. They're doing better. Yeah, I don't know, man. But yeah, this is exactly like, how do we terraform our own culture to be better suited to the work of anti-racist activism? Like, oh, I used the A word. Whoops. But yeah, thanks for the question. You gotta go. You should go.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here, first of all. And I know we're talking about engineering specifically, but as someone who kind of exists in both spaces at an engineering school and then also in these communities, it strikes me that recently, not to minimize the issue, but like in engineering, this is becoming more of a known problem, at least. And it's becoming more clear that engineers need a broader education and that they are actually part of broader systems. And I wonder almost if the greater challenge isn't spaces like this, where we, and by we, I mean, hashtag not everyone here, but like we, like the white liberal progressives who work in tech policy, who think we know this and care about DI and care about systems. I feel like it's almost harder for people like us to recognize and understand that we are also upholding systems of oppression. And so just like selfishly, I was wondering, I know you've like been asked for a lot of advice, but if there's like one thing, actionable thing, and it might, the answer might be no, like that's not even helpful. But like, is there one thing that people could read or a question they could ask themselves over the weekend, like everyone here, that would address kind of our own, blind spots?
Well, I guess the question is, should we answer that question or should we let people comment? Yeah, I haven't answered. I'll let you answer because I answered the other one.
Very quickly, we got you. We'll say in a minute.
My question is sort of a follow-on from 2 questions ago and that last one. So as I teach the Intro to Robotics course, and over the last few years, I've been trying to integrate more things where I have those narratives about how really poor choices like Kodak and their color film have impacted, as engineering decisions. But one of the things I've still struggled with is, like you said, engineers are totally swamped. And so where are the right pressure points to say that and how do you help them with understanding that thinking about it through this lens will actually help their engineering practice? Right? So that's sort of one place I'm still struggling a little bit with. Robotics isn't too bad because it's a multicultural, like we do a lot of different people and we have to all talk to a lot of different people. So I can at least phrase this as like, you have to learn how to talk to other communities because otherwise you won't have the collaborators to do the robotics you want. But I feel like we're still sort of missing that roadmap of like, I want, in my engineering class, I'm willing to take time out to talk about these technology issues, right, that have arisen in the past. So they get that historical narrative. But now I need the piece that says, here's the assignment and the bit where you're going to actually care about this and think about it from the systemic point of view to make your artifact better. And you need to do this because your artifact will be better. So any help or advice on sort of how you make that, integrate that into the engineering practice would actually be really helpful.
Hello, so my name is Mel Cafe. I'm a narrative associate producer on the Halo video game. I'm not speaking on behalf of my employer, so I heed that warning. Yeah, so I liked how in dealing with the initiative for like anti-Blackness, I liked how you mentioned that we could look at it on the foundational level and then also deal with it on the educational level. And then I just want to recommend some potential approaches that you could take this with a grain of salt, and then this could also go out to other people in the audience. Yeah, so I understand, like, I'm familiar with product development, game development, and I think in dealing with anti-Blackness or other pressing issues similar to that, we should look at it, look at the development cycle, or look at it from an ecosystem level, or look at it from the whole product life cycle, as opposed to like the beginning, you know? Because some people think that, oh, if you fix it at the beginning, everything else will be okay. But what happens when we look at the entire life cycle? Like, let's say you're making a video game, who's the target audience? Like, who's playing the game? And then when we look at the numbers and then we think, oh, this is the demographic, let's start tailoring it to these people. But then if you take a step back, I want to make this game more inclusive. So you can think about who you're targeting with this product. And then for the opportunities, like for the people working on the game or the product, are we attracting the right talent? We might be saying like, oh, equal opportunity employers, but there's no persons of color applying. Why is it that? Are there even people in that profession that are a person of color? Are they getting nurtured? Are they getting empowered to be able to pursue those career professions? So if we look at it from like the audience, we look at it from the workplace, from people pursuing those careers, and we also consider to weave it into the creative, into the brand pillars, into the company's principles. I think that I think one method to tackling like those pressing issues, anti-Blackness and similar issues, is to look at it from a bird's eye point of view and then permeate it through the whole like ecosystem, as opposed to just foundational or like the earliest step. And that's just a comment. Yeah. Thank you.
So thank you. I was smiling at him because that's part of one of my other papers is thinking about the software development lifecycle. And so thank you
The
for that
level
comment.
of Scrum
That was,
even.
yeah.
Yeah, it's
So
interesting.
so that was a great comment. If you are interested in working that and being a PhD student, please come see me. Because that's what I have at least one of my students working on now. So
Yeah, we're gonna send you that paper. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to do any last comments for any of the stuff that was asked? Is there anything?
Oh, I mean, I feel like I could talk for
I
another
know.
hour about those last three comments, but like, I think maybe we should say what the one piece of advice we would give for the white liberal audience, you know?
I guess so.
Yeah, I think maybe we should do that one. And everyone else can come talk to us afterwards if you'd like. You go first.
Yeah, because what do you think? Oh man, so yeah, both of them. I wish I could add.
Yeah,
So I think this was actually related to the question you had asked me, and my answer is to remember, given the context we're in, given the policies and the structures that are in place, racial structures and racism, anti-Blackness is the water, right? It's what we're in, and so you have to treat that as the foundation, not as a side. Oh, by the way, because that is the thing, right? That's gonna come. It's gonna come back to that at some point.
Yeah, and I would say on top of that, there's always something you can do. Like there is always something you can do, whether it's like reading something or having a new conversation or leading a session with your group. There's always something you can do. Sort of goes back to this the question after that about like how can you convince people that, you know, thinking about anti-Blackness and the role it plays in their technologies improve the engineering practice, right? So I'm combining two, I'm getting 2 for 1 here, 2 for 1. And I think that like I'm coming from a neurotechnological space. So like we're in the School of Medicine, we're also in the electrical engineering space, but we're also in the computer engineering space. And so I mean, there's less of an overhead for me, like, or the conversation is less difficult because if you produce a technology that nobody wants, then your startup isn't going to get off the ground, right? And if you produce a technology that runs into these moral controversies early on, then your product isn't going to get off the ground, right? You're going to be like all the exoskeleton designers who end up like making products that end up in, collecting dust in people's closets. There's a refrain going around you know, the science and society spaces that I operate within. That thinking about anti-racism and anti-Blackness is, you know, it's important for doing good science. If you're not thinking about these issues, you're not doing good science. So tying these issues to like an idealized form of science has been helpful for me. Would it help for engineering? Like, this is what good engineering looks like. It does a needs assessment of communities of color, for Black people especially, for all of the different intersecting identities. I think so. Yeah, I think it could work. But yeah, maybe that's how we motivate the project. But yeah, okay. So let's cut it off here. If you want to talk to us, we'll be here. Eat lunch with us, I guess, unless you want to eat in peace. I don't know. But yeah, thank you for being
Thank
open
you.
to this session, and see you around.
Thank you, everybody.